head. Okay. So this is the replication crisis in psychology, an overview for theoretical and philosophical psychology. This is in the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. Okay, so this is going to be a bit more sciencey and psychologically oriented. My first time reading it, as always. If you are interested, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you're in chat, the link will be in the notes later if you are watching this on YouTube. And you can also type !paper if you jump into chat late, and the link will pop back up. And this one you have to click through on the philosophical, on the Google Scholar link, and it's there. Okay, so here we go. The replication crisis in psychology, an overview for theoretical and philosophical psychology. In August 2015, with the publication of the Reproducibility Project, RP:*P, maybe that's what they'll be calling it, news outlets all over the world ran headlines declaring what some psychologists had been saying for several years. Psychology is in a replication crisis. As readers of the report zeroed in on RP's the Replication Project Psychology, so RPP's low estimation of a 30% replication rate, many began to question how reliable psychology's research literature actually is. Subsequent developments reveal similar problems in many of the life sciences and social sciences, leading to a broadening of the replication crisis to science more generally. I just want to point out, there was a hilarious website. There was a spoof philosophy news website, and this headline just killed me, that they said what was a famous philosopher was reputation was in tatters because they had apparently made up the results of their thought experiments, and that came out 7 years ago now, when this replication crisis thing was there. I was just dying laughing. I was like, they faked the thought experiment results? Oh my god. Okay. The label, so this has been going on for a while. This is a paper from 3 years ago, 2019. So you got to remember, this is also in the pre-pandemic time. So this is not going to have the flavor of weirdness going on. This is going to have these sort of we're just doing our science and doing our thing, and this is going to be great. So this was written in 2017, 2018, and then it got published in 2019. So this is the before times. Keep that in mind when you're reading the way they're talking about the world too. The label replication crisis suggests that the crisis centers on problematic features to replicate, yet virtually any discussion of a replication crisis ends up pointing to problems in the field that go beyond replication. Yeah, noted. For this reason, some argue for broader terms such as a crisis of confidence to better capture this wider constellation of problems. Others have argued defensively that there is no crisis, or the term crisis at least grossly exaggerates the challenges that psychology faces. Yet others have preferred an optimistic framing of this moment as one of revolution or reform, to shift the emphasis from a discipline in crisis to one progressing into a new era of improved science. That seems like actually a not bad way of saying it, because all science moves forward, and people are always like, oh my god, those scientists of the past, what were they thinking? They had all these weird theories, but that's a normal thing. Psychology is relatively new, basically as a theoretical science, or practical science. It's only been 150 years. Of course, people have been talking about stuff for a lot longer, but it's only been since the 1800s. So I don't think there was any proper psychology before that, or an idea of it being its own thing. And so the idea that maybe there's some growing pains is not a terrible way of looking at this either, which I hadn't really thought of. But that's maybe just apologizing for all their mistakes or in their problems, but still, there's going to be growing pains, and some of them are going to be worse than others. Okay, regardless, the label replication crisis seems to have taken hold most broadly to describe the current critique and reform in psychology, as well as in many other scientists that are confronting similar problems to psychology. Read and Rap says, I could see how bad faith actors could use the crisis terminology to advance their anti-science pseudoscientific theories. That's a fair point. Yeah, and it's interesting. I bet that's the sort of thing that's happened in the last, you can think of the timing. This paper came out in 2019. It was written in the years, it had to be conceived and written in the years prior, because a lot of these things, it takes a while to do all of the work. And so this is in the Trump days of him lambasting science, but this is before, of course, like the current the pandemic, where science became super important. And so then but like they don't have that sort of like they might have an inkling of it, but they don't have like the full on effect of it. Okay. Our purpose in this paper is to provide an overview of the replication crisis. We will offer a brief history of the events that have come to constitute what we call replication crisis, followed by a summary of the major critiques and reforms at the heart of the replication crisis and its associated reform movement. We will then point toward how these major issues intersect with a number of issues that have been central to theoretical and philosophical psychology. In particular, we hope to emphasize how the replication crisis presents rich opportunities for theoretical and philosophical psychologists to collaborate in uniquely contribute to the self-reflection and reform taking place in the field more broadly. A brief history of the replication crisis. Replication and reproducibility have long been held as important pillars within psychological science. Have they? I'm not even sure that's actually true. I mean, we're going to see what they say, but a lot of this stuff I don't actually see as been like really an important pillar. It may have been a pillar, but I don't know if it was an important one. Good evening, Lumpy Dragon Potato. How is our Lumpy Dragon Potato doing tonight? Or today, whatever your time zone is. We're reading a paper on the replication crisis in psychology. It was a request from Read and Rap. Yeah. So this already well, I haven't gotten to what they're saying yet, Read and Rap, but the thing is, this may be a little bit of a hindsight is 2020, and so they're trying to make it look a bit better. Yeah, okay. A lot of chores to prepare for this week. That happens. I am woefully behind on a few things that I need to be doing, and it's bad. I'm always thinking, like, should I be doing something like I need to be doing during Philosophy Roulette, or should I be doing Philosophy Roulette? And the truth is, I had plenty of time today to do the other stuff. I'm avoiding it for whatever reason. But I can just sit down and, like, read philosophy. It's, like, not a problem. So this isn't really getting in my way, but I'm always like, I don't need to be reading philosophy, but, like, fuck that, of course I do. What am I talking about? I need to get online and fucking read philosophy and bullshit. It's, like, goal of my life. I tell people on Twitch, like, a lot of times it's, like, my goal is to provide mildly interesting commentary in chat. And people are like, you have succeeded. Because that's basically the limit of what I can do in chat is like mildly interesting things. Okay, so we'll see if how important the pillar is, they say. The debate of the late 19th century among introspectionists regarding imageless thought, for example, centered around various attempts to replicate the initial studies claiming to demonstrate the phenomenon. Similarly, you see, this is what's interesting, like right here. Introspectionists. I have never heard of introspectionists. Who, like of the late 19th century amount introspectionists. Introspectionists, like they had different words for psychology back in the day because there was no real psychology. But who the fuck? Exactly, Anne. But like I haven't even heard of the introspectionists. So who are these people? And is this just a general term for psychologists, or was this a subgroup that was that thought it was a pillar? Okay. Yeah, and Ogden was a famous person. So Ogden noted this in 1911 is interesting. But it's interesting also that it got noted in 1911 that there was a group of people that thought it was important, because that means it wasn't everybody. It means it was only that one group. Well, they had different words for psychologists back in the day. It wasn't called psychologists. So it may have been a field of thinking. It may have been a different term for some people in psychology. Like, it may have been for, like, I know the experimental field of many psychologists were called introspectionists back in the day. But I don't know. I don't know the history here. Okay. Similarly, Mary Calkins, Neversend Calkins, 1895, interesting, famously challenged Joseph Jastro's claim that men have greater variability than women do in their word associations by conducting a replication of his study, which failed to reproduce the same differences. Interesting, but again, if you are picking out a single effing study from that shows it, it's definitely not a pillar. It just was, she was like calling that motherfucker out, being like, no, women, you can't actually prove what you think you did. So, yeah. But that's really interesting that Mary did pull out the experimental thing to do it. So, but like this again doesn't look like pillar, but these are examples. It's fine. Maybe it's not that far-fetched. Okay, refinements in instrumentation and measurement were likewise taken as advancements toward precision in demonstrating effects that could be reproduced from one lab to the next. Indeed, this thrust toward precision and reproducibility informed Bridgman's operationism that continues to define much of psychological science and inspired the optimism of early behaviorists in pointing to a psychological science centered in empirical observability. Okay, so maybe in the last 100 years, this has been the program though. That's why you can say this is where it started and this has been the program ever since. That would be fair. Psychological measurement tests, measurements such as IQ tests, procedures such as the Stroop test, and instruments such as the Skinner box were all valued in part because of their apparent reliability in repeated experimentation across a variety of contexts. That's fair. Although these movements in early psychological science are not all focused on the type of direct replication that has come to the fore in the modern replication crisis, they do converge on the notion that psychological scientists generally expect that true phenomena should be reproducible. Okay, so, even though we started off with kind of a very strong statement as important pillar, the conclusion here is very, this is not anything that is out there. Psychological scientists generally expect that true phenomena should be reproducible. No fighting in chat. Okay, yeah, fighting chat. What do I care? Just don't let it get out of hand. And don't make paperwork for me. In the mid to late 20th century, conceptual replication received greater emphasis in psychology as a mode for advancing refinement theory, while also demonstrating the reliability of an effect. For example, Strobe and Strack argued that early attempts in cognitive dissonance research to replicate the original paradigm of Festinger and Carl Smith had mixed success, but that conceptual replications in the decade following helped to refine various conditions that allowed researchers to then more reliably produce dissonance effects. Similarly, the advent of systematic literature reviews, and meta-analysis lent psychologists a growing sense that they were participants in a cumulative science with reliable effects, even without conducting direct replication. Of course, criticism of these methods quickly followed, particularly regards toward the file drawer problem. I wonder what that is. But these methods were nevertheless generally adopted with a sense of optimism in their ability, however imperfect, to demonstrate the strength of evidence for an effect and its reliability. Furthermore, as Danziger has demonstrated, this period also saw an emerging methodological standardization in psychology that served to provide a kind of disciplinary unity that the field had not achieved at the level of theory. That is to say, although the intellectual history of psychology appears to be marked by various warring factions and drawn up along theoretical lines, with different camps ascending and receding from dominance in the field, this methodological turn in the mid to late 20th century loosened the grip of theoretical orthodoxy, as psychologists could point to their methodological orthodoxy as a sign of the legitimacy of their work. Thus, various methodological and statistical practices became canonized as algorithms that could provide justification for research claims inasmuch as they presumably systematized the scientific logic that might impartially indicate the strength and likelihood of a finding. In this sense, many psychological researchers in this period were more concerned with whether their methods conformed with the generally accepted practices than they were with direct replication, presuming that these systems of logic would filter out bad theories as they failed these tests, and elevated good theories as they passed these tests. Indeed, a common misconception that p-values below 0.05 have a 95% or better likelihood of replicating may have led researchers to mistakenly believe that replication research was redundant to what they presumed their significance tests already indicated. Yeah, see, this is one of the things. What does exactly a p-value mean? I always forget this stuff, but this p-value of 0.05 meant have a 95% or better likelihood of replicating. So there's interesting things about this that what exactly do the statistics tell you? Many people mess up their statistics. Philosophy of statistics is a very, very, very important and difficult topic that people do not talk about enough. I think Deborah Mayo is in Chapel Hill. So if Akule is still here, Deborah Mayo is like one of the top people in philosophy of statistics, and yeah, like it's super hard to like this stuff is like really important if you want to talk about how to actually I forget exactly what these mean. Like it's probability of some sort, but like it's more important that it's more complicated and more sophisticated than like it says a misconception of something below 0.5 has a 95% or better likelihood. It has something to do with the standard distributions, and I forget what. So, like, if you want to talk about this, it's hard, and people get like what you think. You just it's probability. It's better than this. Not that clear. Okay. Okay. The present crisis. When it comes to the particular, you see, and although this is going to take a while, we've got another like 30 pages to go. Like, this is like history, so it's not going to kill me, I don't think. P is a positive probability because Q is a negative P. If I'm not, see, you might be right. You might know this better than I do. I just don't know. I just know it's complicated, really, Ann. So like, if that is what it is, you set me straight. But like, it's just they just say this is a misconception that it's like 0.05 is a 95% or better likelihood. It's not. Like, they're just saying that right here. Like, misconception. Okay. When it comes to the particular problems that are most commonly identified as comprising psychology's replication crisis, critics have long raised concerns and offered detailed analysis of the nature of these problems, with critiques often going back many decades. Why then is it only in the last several years that these problems have risen to the level of a crisis that the discipline is taking seriously in ways that we have not in the past? For many psychologists, particularly those within the subfields of social and personal psychology, 2011 was a watershed year for the replication crisis. At least 3 key developments stand out from that year. Okay, so maybe there was like, a significant event that, brought this to a head. First, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology infamously published Darrell Bem's 2011 article, Feeling the Future, in which he claimed to demonstrate evidence for the parapsychological phenomenon of precognition. Oh, that's amazing. I did not know that there was a parapsychology paper that got published and freaked people out. Okay, in simple terms, p-value is the probability of X happening. Okay, but yes. Okay, so I wonder what the misconception is then, because, yeah, just because it has a probability doesn't mean it won't. Yeah, so maybe what the target of the probability then for replication. So that's the thing of it happening. Maybe it's not the likelihood of replication. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah. I wonder, like, now I don't know what the replication problem is because I don't know what the p-values mean. And especially if it is just the probability of some phenomenon. Thank you, Ann. Okay. Many psychologists took issue with the fact that a major journal would publish a paper on a phenomenon that they presumed de facto to be untenable, and thus argued that Bem's supposed evidence was likely the result of problematic research practices rather than actually being evidence for precognition. Nevertheless, when researchers attempted to publish replications of Bem's work that showed no evidence for precognition, they were initially rejected by several outlets, including JPSP, because the editors did not deem direct replication sufficiently important to accept in their journals. Yeah, so people don't always accept negative results. Like, they don't want just response papers. They want positive new things, not response papers. Thus, although critics had already pointed to methodological problems in psychology that could account for findings like Bem's, the embarrassment that many felt with the publication of Bem's paper and the subsequent roadblocks to the self-correction process of replication made all the more urgent the need for the discipline to more directly address and correct the potential problems that this episode highlighted. And this is a general problem in science and, in philosophy publishing, not so much philosophy, because we have negative results that can get published in philosophy, but like, it's harder to publish just a response paper if you're just saying someone's wrong. That won't get published in the same journal unless it's like a gross error. But in sciences, you need a new thesis, and proving somebody else is wrong is not something new. It's just proving that a paper is wrong, and they won't always accept those because on the grounds that they're just not doing anything new, even if like it does show that something that had been done was done incorrectly. Okay. So, but like that's a problem, and this is why people fake results. Like it's serious, because if you want to get a good job, you need positive results. And if the end up of all years of your PhD work turns out that you don't have any new results, you won't get a good job, and your life is basically like going to go down the shitter because you're going to get like no job, and you're going to be unhappy, and your family, your partner's going to leave you, and all this stuff. This is why people fake results, because how are you supposed to know that when you started your PhD like 5 years before that, 5 years later, you wouldn't get the results that you hoped for, but it was always possible. But like that's part of academia. Okay. Second, 2011 is also the year that social psychologist Diederik Stapel's extensive research fraud was discovered and publicized. Staple, a leader in his field with dozens of publications in top journals, was shown to have fabricated data on a majority of his published research studies, including those he supervised for doctoral students. Wow. So all these people that he supervised are screwed now too. That Staple managed to go so long undiscovered in his fraud again raised alarms about the possibility that the supposed quality control mechanisms in psychological science were somehow failing. This sense of insecurity was only heightened alongside other smaller cases of fraud that emerged around the same time. Lumpy Dragon Potato said, "In chemistry, we do get these situations from time to time, but when a new paper makes a splash, people use the new reaction conditions quickly. If it doesn't work, the splashy paper gets forgotten, criticized fairly quickly." That's interesting, but I think chemistry might even be special in this regard because chemistry is the largest topic in the entire world. I believe chemistry has more papers published than any other science or anything for that matter. And so maybe there's more people looking at stuff and more people working on it in that area. So maybe chemistry is actually in a healthier shape than psychology is. But that's super interesting also because I don't know how difficult the American Chemical Society's largest scientific organization on earth, I believe it. I mean, I don't know if there's actually significant difficulties in setting up chemical experiments. Like, I know sometimes you need like very high pressures or high heats or cold heats or whatever it is, but like most competent labs could probably handle this sort of stuff, and so I don't know how like exotic certain things would have to be. It varies widely. Okay, yeah, because I'm sure there's things that are hard to just go test because whatever it needs, like you might need there used to be actually a few miles from here an old chemical plant, and when I was because it was back when I was in high school, I interned there, and they actually had a high pressure building where that was really far away from all the other buildings where they could do high pressure chemistry experiments. It wasn't used for that. They just did normal experiments there that you didn't need high pressure stuff, but they could have done extremely dangerous high pressure experiments in that building because it was set away from everything else, and if it exploded, it would be okay. It says no one cares about corroborating data in the humanities. From what you've seen, I believe it. I mean, philosophy is not like that because you read it and anyone who's competent most of the time can tell. It's the problems are subtle in philosophy, but most of the time, someone who's very good, they'll be able to nah, that's just wrong and this is why. But other stuff, I just don't know if anyone cares about it. Although, I was thinking that paper we read a few roulettes ago on aesthetics, I was maybe that guy was it was a weird paper. I was maybe that guy's just a troll and wrote a troll paper. I'm starting to think maybe that was the case with that one because it was so weird and so wrong. Anyway, it was instructive what it was. But yeah. Okay, so we had what was it? So we had parapsychology, we had a big fraud, and what's the third one? Third, this was also the year that saw the publication of Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson's False Positive Psychology, Undisclosed Flexibility in Data Collection and analysis, allowing presenting anything as significant in psychological science. In this paper, the authors drew attention to the widespread use of so-called questionable research practices and demonstrated the ways that these practices were likely dramatically inflating the false positive rate in the psychological literature beyond what many believed was the case. Using practices, you know what I'm going to do? So if anyone's like looking at this, I just want to write something down. Replication crisis. This is what we're talking about. If anyone is coming in, because I see the numbers going up and down. So, okay. Yeah, so this is questionable research practices. Using practices common in psychological research, they presented a pair of studies that culminated in evidence for musical contrast and chronological rejuvenation, an impossible phenomenon in which participants became approximately a year and a half younger by listening to When I'm 64 by the Beatles rather than a control song. They then showed how they arrived at that result by stopping data collection only when they saw significant findings, collecting many dependent variables while only reporting those that showed statistical significance, including many positive covariants to churn through their analysis until they found those that pushed results into significance, while only reporting those successful covariants and making exclusion rules that pushed results toward significance. They explained that these decisions were researcher degrees of freedom, legitimate decisions that researchers could plausibly make in a variety of justified ways, but that can be abused when they are made in ad hoc ways that play into a researcher's potential confirmation bias. You know, this is called, in the philosophical literature, it's not a common fallacy. It's called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where you just, like, you shoot at a wall and, like, you make a lot of spots, and then you go over there and you draw, bullseyes around where your bullet holes were, and like, hey, look, I hit the wall. But what you're really doing is you're selecting the spots that you actually hit, and you're not allowed to do that. Is basically what it is. You're just picking what you want to hit, and then you're hitting stuff, and then you're saying that's what I meant to do, and you're making a theory about that, and that's ad hoc, and it's very, very naughty. Okay, again, the critiques of these questionable practices was not new. Many researchers recognized already that these are not ideal practices, but Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson demonstrated concretely how researchers could easily create what looks like positive evidence for a false theory, just in the ways that many psychologists suspected that Bem had managed to do with precognition. However, their critique cut well beyond metaphysically questionable theories such as chronological rejuvenation and precognition, as the practices they called into question were in widespread practice throughout many labs investigating much more conventional phenomena. Okay, so there was some methodological bad things going on, and they called it out. The confluence of these events provided a collective challenge to the credibility of psychological science. They not only called into question widespread conventional research practices, but also offered dramatic cases of fraudulent and questionable research that had managed to clear traditional safeguards of research quality. The rising unease that this produced, alongside the lackluster response to attempts to replicate Bem's studies, led to a growing concern that the reliability of psychological research has, in fact, largely gone untested with direct or close replication. Accordingly, the end of 2011 also saw the launch of the Open Science Collaboration's Reproducibility Project, aiming to test how well the psychological research literature actually replicates. The subsequent publication of RPP in 2015, with its estimate of replication at 36% to 47%, drew widespread attention to claims that psychology has a replication problem, and drew attention across not only the various subdisciplines of psychology, but also in other human sciences such as medicine and economics that appeared to be facing similar problems. The prominent coverage of psychology's replication crisis marked by the RPP brought greater focus and momentum to other replication and reform initiatives already underway, as well as those that follow. These include the many labs projects, the Registered Replication Reports initiative sponsored by the Association for Psychological Science, and the Psychological Science Accelerator. Likewise, the aftermath of the RPP also saw rebuttals to the study, including the argument that RPP actually produced results that are statistically consistent with what the replication studies would have predicted, and the argument that an alternative analysis claimed to correct for errors in the RPP showed relatively high rates of replication. In spite of these rebuttals, and particularly with the added momentum of additional replication efforts showing similarly low replicability, evidence continued to mount that psychology is indeed in the midst of a replication crisis. It's like, okay, so maybe it's not as bad as they said, but it seems to be that there's been enough confirmation of the replication problem, so the replication crisis has been replicated where the other stuff hasn't, is really what's going on here. And that's kind of funny, but sad. Okay. Oh boy, 4 times this. A lot of pages to go. Major issues and reforms. As we've suggested, the replication crisis in psychology has actually drawn critical focus to a complex of problems in the discipline that includes, but is not limited to, replication. We offer here a brief overview of the major critiques and reforms arising from the replication crisis. Replication and replicability. Perhaps the most evident issue of concern in the replication crisis is the role of replication in psychological science and the degree to which major psychological findings can and should be expected to be replicated. Many in the field argue that psychologists have been addressing replication all along by incorporating conceptual replication in their research. However, reformers have argued that conceptual replications are susceptible to many of the same problems that may inflate false positives in the research literature, and they may not be sufficient to establish the reliability of a given finding. Specifically, critics have argued that the conceptual replications are susceptible to publication bias, as researchers are less likely to submit failed conceptual replications for publication, and journal editors are less likely to accept them if they are submitted. Likewise, conceptual replications are most likely to be conducted by the same labs involved in producing the original effects, and thus may be more susceptible to confirmation bias through recognized QRPs, that's questionable research practices, as well as the additional researcher degrees of freedom involved in modifying the research protocol. Simmons argues that the only independent direct replications can provide strong evidence for or against the reliability of a given finding. And that's fair, because if you have the setup in your lab and you're the one doing this work, someone else would have to come by and replicate not only they have to replicate your entire lab setup. It's not so easy to do this. It's not like as Lumpy Dragon Potato says, it varies widely what different people have capabilities of doing. And so it's not so easy to set up. We do these physics experiments and you can do one of them. They're very difficult. There may be one lab capable of doing certain things because of the physical location in the world that they are. And so again, that's not the same for psychology, but it may just be hard to get maybe one person got tens of thousands of people to answer a quiz. That may be very hard for other labs to accomplish, getting tens of thousands of people, and it may be because the country or that city that the person's in allows for them to do this, but it's not easy to get maybe 10,000 people to sit down and take a test. So not so clear about how one can go about doing this research. Okay, replication has likewise provided a central benchmark for the state of psychological science, as results from large-scale replications such as the RPP have shown much lower than expected rates of replication, as prominent psychological constructs have been called into question in light of unsuccessful replications. Psychologists and others have taken these findings as a sign that psychological research may lack credibility. However, replication has not only been key in diagnosing the health of the discipline, but also in shaping reform. That is, many proposed reforms are intended to better facilitate replication. For example, many journals now encourage authors to publicly post the materials from their study and award an open materials badge to authors who do so. Sharing materials alongside reforms calling for more thorough documentation of methods and procedure generally can help independent labs to better approximate the crucial elements of a study as they attempt to replicate it. Likewise, many of the reforms discussed below are expressly concerned with realigning the incentive structures in science to better reward and thus encourage replications. Yeah, and you'll see people say all of our data is published here. like in like they'll have like files you can download, be like, this is our raw data, and you can do that, and like you'll get like spreadsheets of data. Of course, you don't know if they fudged the data, but like at least now they're showing you what it looks like. And of course, if you're gonna fudge data, that takes more time and effort. My friend, streamer buddy, Kairos. So if you are interested in like SPSH Kairos, if you're interested in like AI or computer programming or MATLAB or anything like that, he's programming AIs to play video games. Like he's got like a Pac-Man AI he's working on. It also plays a Breakout and like a bunch of other games. So he's making a generalized video game AI for old school video games. Very cool stuff. But he also has multiple advanced degrees in hard sciences. And he was saying when he was doing like his physics, I forget, master's or PhD, he actually considered how much work it would be to fake the data on his work. And because, it was getting to the point where it's so hard and you need good results that he was thinking, what would it actually require for him to fake it so that he could, get some good results? And he realized it would require just about the same amount of work to fake the results as it would be to actually go do the work. And so basically, it's like it didn't actually pay off to attempt to fake physics. So... But like, yeah, it did cross his mind. But like, that's the thing. Once you force people to show more of their work, it's harder for them to lie. And so that's good. That's good practice now to publish as much of your work as you can. Like I said, in philosophy, usually if you have like logic, you have to publish your proof. If you have like an argument, you have to show all the details. And if you cover anything up, people are going to call you out on and be like, what happened, like, right over here, like that part of the paper right there, like I'm doing right here when I go like this, I'm like, what the hell is this thing? Like that's you can, like, it's pretty simple to do because it has to be on the page in philosophy. Otherwise it's just, they didn't argue. Okay. Questionable research practices. We have already provided at least partial treatment of QRP's questionable research practices in our summary of Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson's false positive psychology, but it's worth emphasizing that a major point of critique and reform has been identifying and challenging QRPs. John Lowenstein and Prelek conducted a survey that found that instances of QRPs in psychology are quite high, perhaps even the norm. And see, that's not good. That you say that things that are questionable are perhaps even the norm. So that means it's more than 50%. Although QRPs are problematic methodologically, this prevalence suggests that they are widely tolerated, if not accepted, by many psychologists. Thus, Sitzma suggests that QRPs lie in the middle of an ethical continuum, with responsible conduct of research at one end and fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism on the other, indicating that QRPs tend not only to include truly severe transgressions in research, but rather those potentially problematic practices that researchers might be tempted to justify. Read Map says, I wonder if it scales down in difficulty the less hard sciences you go, for lack of better terminology. What do you mean scales down in difficulty? Like, you think it's easier to do in psychology than physics? In the hard sciences, and you're saying going into the social sciences. It depends. I think it depends on what area you're in any area. Like if you try to people do different bad things in physics. Like people steal each other. Everyone steals each other's results. Are there questionable research practices? Maybe, but then again, this actually is a good point. I'm glad you brought this up. And they mention it right here, but they went really fast. There's a continuum with responsible conduct of research at one end. You can, if you have some idea, like if you have some insight, like you actually figure some stuff out, and your studies are just kind of not showing it, but you're still right, maybe you can direct what people are looking at in a good way to actually get to the underlying thing. Now, could you have done a better experiment to show it? Yes. But have you done anything unethical? No, in the sense that you actually do understand the phenomenon, and maybe you have good reason for showing it, but you don't have all your ducks in a row right now. And so the idea is that there may be more leeway in these sciences where it's not like there, where things are not as clear. Maybe you can actually, help things along by, putting a little bit of emphasis on what you actually know to be important for whatever reason. But like, you're not actually fabricating, falsifying, or like, cherry picking data. You're just, you are kind of massaging the data, but like in certain areas, like there may just not be anything better to do. And like, so it may not be the best research practice, but it may be the best we got right now. And so that is still being responsible because this is the best we can do. So that's the question. Is this the best we can do? It might be the best we can do. And in that case, it's not, you can't really fault them. Yeah. So that's really what's at issue here, is that like, if you're moving in a science where you don't have good, data, you need to find good data. You have to do stuff to get that good data. And that's harder than it's easier said than done. Okay. In general, QRP is questionable research practices allow researchers to selectively report their study in ways that bias findings towards their research hypotheses. Yeah, but like I said, if you're doing this in a way like their research hypotheses, but maybe it's not like theirs. Maybe it's like there's a good reason it is a research hypothesis, and make it more likely that they will be able to successfully publish their research. Yeah, see, this is the thing. If they're not doing it for selfish reasons, maybe they're doing it because the phenomenon is there, then that's the thing. Megalomorph, hello. The need for good data reminds me of the mantra for data science, garbage in, garbage out. Absolutely. And that's the thing. How do you get good data in psychology? What actually is that thing? Yeah, Megalomorph, I hope you're doing a good day. Welcome in. I read philosophy here and comment. There's like a reaction stream actually at the moment. And so if you have any questions, let me know. This is the first time I'm reading it. We're talking about the replication crisis in psychology. But yeah, that's the thing. In computer science, what actually, in data science, where does the raw data come from? And this is one of the problems actually in AI research. Like people, they put the fucking bots online and they get garbage in, and you get a garbage bot that's like saying crazy things, and it's like, well, what did you think was gonna happen? Garbage in, garbage out. But what actually counts as legitimate talk? And that's very hard to do. Oh, you're a mathematician. I'm here because Reading Rap told me I might be interested in the discussion. Well, welcome in. We do some of okay, cool.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Side Semiotics gifted 1 bits. Side Semiotics says, cheer.
Thank you, Semiotics. Welcome in. Appreciate it. Oh, yeah, cool. Welcome in, Megalomorph. Yeah, we're talking about replication crisis. Replication is stuff. Hey, Shane, what's up? Your statistics professor once said, if you torture the data enough, it will tell you whatever you want to hear. Yeah, that's the old thing, is you can always lie with statistics. That's my dad used to always say that. If anyone here does not know Shane, you should go hang out at Shane's place. Shane is a historian and sociologist, and yeah, it's great. I haven't been over there, and I don't know if he was streaming. Oh, is your computer better now? I don't remember. But yeah, like, go hang out with Shane, sociology and history, and you can ask him basically anything about history, and he'll go look it up.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Side Semiotics gifted 1 bits. Side Semiotics says, Shannon Sinis cheer.
Shannon Simmons. Thank you, Semiotics. I appreciate it. Yeah, how to lie with statistics. Yep, Shane. Yeah, so we were talking about p-values earlier. I don't actually understand p-values, but I know that people screw them up, and so that's sort of the thing. Yeah, so what I was just saying here, what was I saying? Garbage in, garbage out, as Megalomorph was mentioning. It's like, where do you get good data? It's very hard. And so when you're in a science like psychology, where maybe there isn't good data for what you're studying, then you have to do stuff to get the good data. And in that case, you are picking things to look at.
Side Semiotics subscribed. Side Semiotics says, if P, then Q.
Thank you for the subs into Semiotics. I appreciate it. If P, then Q. Yes, that's right. I have this, I don't know if it'll show up right here. I have a wonderful emote that I got on gift sub. I love this one. Here we go. Megalomorph, I once saw a video of someone at a conference psychology, and they were doing one of those man on the street cycle videos with professors asking what does a p-value mean, and everyone got it wrong. I don't know what a p-value means. I should know what it means, but I don't even know. Yeah, like, why would I know what that is unless I'm actually doing science? I'm not actually doing science. I should know because I am doing science adjacent things, but I forgot what it is. So it's like, I'm sorry. But like, yeah, it's probability value, but I don't know exactly how this one's calculated. And yeah, thanks again for the sub, Cinesemiotics. I appreciate it. We were talking about the replication crisis in psychology and wider. Cinesemiotics, I honestly did not know it would interrupt because it was just a toggle switch asking if I want to brag about my 19th month anniversary stream. No, don't worry about interrupting. And I love the fact I get to have these fun things pop up on stream. No more tips? All right, whatever. No, I liked the break, actually. It's kind of good. Okay, p-value is the probability you would get as a result at least as extreme as observed if the null hypothesis were true, I think. I started like an hour ago, but this is a very long paper, so we're not even halfway through. Thank you, Megalomorph. Yeah, see, this is the thing. I know it's the probability I would get, but I'm not entirely sure what the meaning of extreme is in this case. And like the null hypothesis being true, like exactly the opposite. Like hypothesis or nothing was happening. So it's interesting, and I feel bad. This is like something I should know. You know, some biologists that have forgetting about p-values. Don't feel bad. I can feel bad if I want. Thank you very much. Yeah, you'll hold suggestions for next time. Oh, okay. Well, you can suggest. Yeah, I won't be. I'm gonna have to do something short after this. So suggestions are fine, but like this is a suggestion from Read and Rap. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what was I saying? Whatever. Garbage in, garbage out, as it was said. Well, if I ever stream again, you can come and ask me about p-values, but I can't promise it will ever happen. Okay. You know, I'll drop your follow then. Boom. Follow. Yeah. Okay. For this reason, reformers have not only sought to delegitimize questionable research practices through their critiques, but also to provide stricter accountability for these research practices. For example, Simons, Nelson, and Simonson argue that researchers should use language that specifies the entirety of what they did. For example, we collected only the following dependent variables. P-values increase over time until there's a correction after the Q. Okay. And that reviewers and editors should require researchers to provide such language. This, they argue, would remove the possibility of misrepresenting their research through omission and put them in a position to actively deceive in order to misrepresent, a threshold they argue fewer researchers are willing to cross. Shane says, so real basic, what's the chance of my situation is the actual cause versus it just being random chance? Yeah, so this is what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be like versus the null value, which is the random chance, the actual thing. And as Megalomorph said, it's the most extreme case. So like in the least likelihood case, could this have happened as a null in the null case where it would have happened randomly? And I don't know exactly what that is. And that's why I think earlier I mentioned that p-values, yes, I was discussing with Anne, it is probability, but the extreme case means you have to be a few standard deviations out of the a practical solution to the pervasive problems of p-values. I did not mention I don't know it. If you want to drop a link, please do, but like it's good to know that there is a paper to be read about this. But yeah, there's something about like you have to be a few like standard deviations off. That means it would be very extreme if it were for it to have happened. Thank you, Megalomorph. Can you get brief on the Humean conception of causation? I think would benefit this conversation. Oh God, don't ask me to jump between things. Okay, Hume basically had a version of the universe that kind of looked like a pool table where like one ball would hit another ball, and so like it would bounce off of it. So you have a causal chain of things here, and so the problem is you have to have a lot of things going into that causal chain. I don't know if I'm going to get this right. Yeah, so you're trying to find this causal chain. And this is basically what it is. The problem here is that what exactly is the thing that's moving in this in psychology? Are there drives, as like Nietzsche would have said, like within us that like cause us to go and do things? We have a like, you know, a sexual drive, and so we go out and try to find a mate or something like that. Or you have a drive to eat, and so you have these things like that. I mean, then you come in with much more psychologically sophisticated things, like, you know, you have like Freudian things, you have other ideas, then you have also you know, like hierarchy, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of like social acceptance, like of course food, water, housing, things like that. And so you're trying to actually locate these sorts of things that are driving us to do stuff, but they're not like objects, and so you can't actually go, so identifying them as a hard thing gets much more complicated. Shane said, yeah, they want you to be able to show that it is very certain, not random chance, usually 98.5 or higher. You bring him back to undergrad days. Reading Rep says that's nice. Cinesemiac says the idea is that causation is an abstraction, does not exist outside of psychological grappling with stuff happening. Yeah, I mean, we're trying to find a causal structure, but what exactly is happening in the world is very difficult. Okay, so that part of Hume. Yeah, so it's like, well, we are describing it, what's happening, but that doesn't mean actually that is the truth in the world. We can basically, you know, hypothesize that there is a causal structure, like this ball hit that ball, but like, you know, that's sort of a psychological thing even at that point. And so yeah, with stuff happening, but there's only correlations. We see correlations as maybe what cinesemiotics was getting at, and that was something Hume was harping on, was that we are trying to find causal structures, but basically we're saying when this ball hits that ball, the other ball moves. That's a correlation. Do we know that it was caused this way? Not necessarily. Michael Morph says, I know it's hard to prove causation instead of just correlation, but I've been meaning for a few years to learn about Judea-Pearl's causal calculus. Yeah, and Shane says, I would think psychology would be really hard to prove conclusively given the human element. But that's part of the issue here, is that they think they're moving in a direction that they can prove more and more things, and then they get these problems where maybe they've not been, some of the underlying data is wrong to begin with. We only disprove in science. We don't prove anything. I mean, depends who you ask in semiotics, but yeah. Okay. Where was I? But feel free to keep asking questions. But yeah, it's like, what exactly are we looking at? And as was said earlier, data garbage in, garbage out. But then how do you find this stuff even in psychology? Because we do have we do have a psychology that is part of our lives, and so there has to be something there. But how exactly do you drill down what it is that we're looking at? And so they're saying, right in this paragraph, that you have to you force people to specify exactly what the variables were. We only looked at these dependent variables. So exactly what were you looking at? And until you say exactly what you were looking at, maybe they haven't actually given you like their full data. Yeah, the mechanisms. Thank you, cinesemiotics. Okay. So yeah, they would have to, and this is what they said, you would have to actively deceive in order to misrepresent. And that's what my our buddy Kairos was saying, is that like he considered it, but it'd be so hard if he had to actually fake all the data himself. Oh, mechanism is the answer, whether abstract mechanism or tangible. Okay, if like, it's more to it than that, though. I think it's that the data itself is suspect. Like, what is the data? So there has to be a mechanism there, and there has to be like raw things to like the mechanism to work on. And what is it like in the psychology that is mechanical, like that is mechanically working? That's sort of like an old-timey version of like the brain that's like, you know, all cogs, but like that we're still in that world. Like, I don't even want to make fun of people that like the old-time like version of like phrenology, because frankly we're not that far out from it, and once you start pushing on these theories, we are getting into mechanical talk. So like, that's not wrong, but it's even more complicated and worse than just mechanisms. Okay. So others have argued that researchers ought to register or pre-register their methodological and analytical plans ahead of data collection, thus separating methodological decisions from their possible influence on the study's results. Okay, so we all have to abstract all of them, right? Yeah. That's the problem. This is interesting here. This is an interesting suggestion, saying that you have to like pass not an ethics board, but a a methodological board showing exactly your stuff. So like, would you have to pass that in psychology to say before we even do the psychological study, do you have to pass a like methodology board? That would be cool. The brain's layout may not match our cognitive map. Yeah, nasty abstractions when it comes to the mind. It's like not even like they don't even make sense at times. Okay, I like this suggestion right here though. This is like super interesting that you'd have to like pass a methodological check before even attempting to do it. Like you'd have to pass an ethics check when doing studies. Pre-registration. You read something about that. That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder if they're doing it. Like it's not actually a bad idea. It's basically a nanny state, but like maybe that's what we need. A little bit of nanny to state watching the psychologist to make sure they're not doing silly things. Okay. Publishing practices. Because researchers experience strong pressure to publish in high-impact outlets, and because such outlets generally have a reputation for publishing novel and positive findings, critics suggest that these pressures can lead to researchers to engage in questionable research practices that will make their findings more attractive for publication in these journals. Yeah, this is one of the big things that is a problem everywhere, not just psychology. Furthermore, these same publication standards discourage publication of negative findings and replications, leading to an incomplete literature that is biased towards positive findings. Various reforms have been proposed to disrupt the system and practices surrounding publication in order to better align the interests of researchers and editors with the interests of the broader scientific community. For example, the Center for Open Science proposed that journals offer their authors badges for practices such as sharing their data. I just want to... Who the fuck gives it... Like, I mean, unless you're on a goddamn social media site, who the fuck cares about a little badge? Like, what's that gonna fucking do? Give me some money or something, motherfucker. Michael Morph said, I also read about pre-registration studies to make sure that people don't hide results when they weren't what they wanted them to be, though I don't think anything ever came of it. I bet not. I mean, that would be... you're basically guaranteeing yourself to put a lot of work in for what's the... Yeah, again, what is the benefit to the researcher? Are you getting yourself a little sticker on a website? Like, is that what you're getting? Why does anyone care about that? You're not getting paid. If money was behind this, that'd be one thing, but you know, a sticker on a website, like go on Reddit, you can get like a little thing.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Side Semiotics gifted 100 bits. Side Semiotics says, cheer.
Thank you. You know, I think I knocked off the number bit. I meant to knock off the whole thing, but I knocked off, I should have said cheer 100. Yeah, exactly. Read map, but like, this is people's job. If you want people to like do something, change the way they're going to do their work, you got to give them more than like a sticker. And like stickers are great. Like you get like the emotes here on Twitch, which is wonderful and I love them, but like frankly, like you can like have as many emotes as you want, but yeah, well, thank you, Cinesemiacs. I don't really ask for money on the stream. I don't plan on making much money from philosophy, but thank you. But like, yeah, give me money. Like, if you want people to change the way they're doing their job, you better make that part of them getting paid. Because otherwise you're doing stuff for, work for free. Because, giving someone a sticker is like, back when you're in elementary school, you got like a good star. Like, that's great. But that don't work for anyone really old, over the age of like 10, if you want them to actually do anything. If publishers refuse to publish results that weren't pre-registered, that would be a pretty big incentive. Yeah, but like that would take a huge amount of change in the industry and like in academia. So like that's not going to happen.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Side Semiotics gifted 42 bits. Side Semiotics says, sheer bill stick.
Oh, it got cut. That's interesting. I wonder why. Bill Sticker's cut. Bill Stickers is innocent. That's interesting. I don't know why I got cut off right there. Readmap says that would require widespread systemic change, but a worthy goal nonetheless. Yeah, but like, is that really the solution then if it's going to take that much work? Maybe there's other ways to go about it or better ways. I don't know. It might be good. Why did that break? I'm going to have to fix that later. That's going to be a pain in the butt. Yeah, okay. Okay. Let's see, where was it? Yeah. So these folks, likewise, the Transparency and Openness Committee offered a set of tiered guidelines for journals on how they could adopt practices that encourage greater openness and transparency in research practice that could broaden acceptance standards to include null findings in replication studies. According to the Center for Open Sciences, these guidelines have been formally adopted by 1,000 journals. No, I know it's I know I got the joke. I was more annoyed that the TTS got cut off. I was like sad your joke didn't get read out loud. Shane says, I want a little badge that shows I spent a hella long time writing a paper. It got accepted and they delayed publication. The editor left. The new editor went AFK and I get an email out of the blue asking me to resend the paper since the new editor has lost my paper. I'm sorry, Shane, that you even had you have to write that out because I'm sure that's true. That's unbelievably frustrating. Yeah, I've waited for an ungodly amount of time just to get rejected with no comments at journals because they were so poorly run. And they used to be good journals, but then it was just oh, that was Friday. Wow, that's, I'm sorry, Shane, that's terrible. Well, if they still, oh my god. Yeah, I'm sorry. Hopefully they'll publish it regardless, but it's I just don't know. What's fine about that? If they publish it post haste, then it'll be better, but that's just terrible. And and there's nothing that can be you can't write that down for your bosses or for something else. It's this got accepted for publication 3 years ago and then the journal fell apart. Can institutions get dementia? They can get brain drain. Everyone can leave. Institutional memory is a problem there, I take it. It's fine, you just resent it. Yeah, well, one hopes it's fine. I don't have much faith in the journal at the moment. Yeah, I mean, institutional memory, exactly what do you mean by that? But, there are structural and systemic problems in, institutions, and that's part of the issue here. They should make a journal of rejection studies. At least you'll get guaranteed rejection response time from the editors. There is a journal of universal rejection. It was just a website that bounced an email that said, thank you for submitting your your paper to the journal. We're sorry, but you have been rejected. So there used to be a website like that. Shane says, I didn't tell my bosses I wrote the paper or that I got accepted. What I do in my spare time is mine. Okay, that's fair. But yeah, if people were expecting that to come out or something, or you're using that on a job application forthcoming. But yeah. Well, Cinesemiotics, we wish that things were better run, but it's just not the. Yeah, well, things in academia suck. So yeah, we do all wish that these places were well functioning. But it's not always the case. Okay, some reforms have called for more dramatic revisions of publication practices. Srivastava, for example, proposed that the Pottery Barn rule, you broke it, you bought it, should apply to scientific journals, meaning that the journal should have a responsibility to publish replication studies that fail to reproduce findings originally published in their journal. Chambers, 2016, an editor at the journal Royal Society Open Science, responded by adopting the policy that the journal would not only publish replication studies of studies from their own pages, but also from 20 other major psychology and neuroscience journals. So they're just saying, all right, we're going to publish all that, and we're going to make a point of it. Nosek and Lakins likewise proposed a major change to peer review in their call for journals to adopt registered reports. Registered reports seek to divorce the review process from study results by having research submit a thorough study plan for peer review, which provisionally accepted based on the strength of their methodological and analytic plan. Researchers pre-register their plan and then submit a final report for review that verifies their adherence to the accepted plan. This approach, Nosek and Lakins argue, prevent publication decisions based on the results and could promote a more balanced research literature. Okay, that's interesting. So you're separating out the experimentalists from the theoreticians. So you basically have people who are doing theory, and then once the data comes up, then the theory people and the data people have to agree that both do what they say they did. So that's interesting. So it's basically splitting the research. So you can't conform your data to the theory because it's not the same group of people, and so that's really interesting that they'd basically break the science in two. Okay. Null hypothesis significance testing. Null hypothesis significance testing has been called into question by reformers at least two fronts: gameability, also known as p-hacking, and hegemony. P-hacking is a broad term describing a collection of activities with the end goal of finding the p of less than 0.05. These activities include manipulation at the level of data, for example, inconsistently including or excluding outliers to reach an appropriate p-value, or at the level of analysis, for example, comparing many subgroups until finding a significant result, many of which are listed as questionable research practices above. Each of these practices creates the illusion of a rigorous statistical test but violates assumptions about the analytical process. Similarly, the incentives associated with meeting the benchmark of p being less than 0.05 that likely motivate p-hacking are implicated in the critiques of publication practices discussed above. The near hegemony of the NHST should be clear reading any quantitative. Excuse me. Spilled water all over myself. P-hacking, the rebellious child, yeah. The near hegemony of NHST should be clear reading any quantitative psychology journal. The reporting of p-values is ubiquitous, and an appropriate p-value is traditionally considered the mark for whether a study is publishable. This represents a standard by which a broad swath of science is judged in spite of a host of well-known criticisms. Yeah, I don't think people really love p-values anymore, but people still do it. The primary alternative is a Bayesian approach to analysis. One advantage of Bayesian analysis is that it aims to address likely future events given the past. Well, I mean, they say they do. I don't always believe the Bayesians at this point. This has particular relevance for those concerned with replicability. A secondary alternative would be to retain the frequentist roots of NHST, but reject the use of p-values in favor of reporting effect size with confidence intervals. See, this is interesting. I don't know what NHST means, but the idea, there's different interpretations of probability, and so there's frequency people versus there's Bayesians, and so there's different sort of understandings of how this goes. And so you've got, instead of p-values, you do confidence intervals, and it's a slightly different understanding of a similar idea. And so they're thinking maybe if we go back to this sort of related but not exactly the same idea, we'd have a different, it wouldn't be as bad. And I don't know, but it's possible. Okay, even reformers who are reluctant to abandon NHST tend to agree with its critics that the convention of judging statistical significance with the threshold of p being less than 0.05, null hypothesis significance testing, okay, thank you, Shane, has not only invited p-hacking, but perhaps also set a standard that is too permissible to false positives. Thus, some null hypothesis significance testing sympathizers have proposed a much lower threshold of p being 0.005, so that's 10 times more significant. Where others have argued that the alpha level in NHST ought to be deliberately determined and justified in the context of each particular study, similar to other analytical decisions. Yeah, so in that case, it's based on what you're talking about, what does the p-value, what is actually significant there? Which is also an interesting way of going about it, because then you have to also justify the whole testing setup, not just use 0.05 or 0.005, but then you have to theorize all the testing right there in respect to what you're doing, which is a huge amount of work. Okay, in response, Trafimo et al. Argued that none of these proposals are satisfactory in overcoming the fundamental problems with NHSD, and that inference should not be based on any sort of cutoff decisions, Bayesian or frequentist. Instead, they call for inference to be based on cumulative evidence from multiple independent studies, and for judgments of the strength of evidence to consider auxiliary assumptions, the strength of the experimental design, and implications for applications. So this is a meta-analysis. So you don't actually get to publish anything, but you have to design meta-studies where multiple things are coming at it from different sides, and then only the meta-study is allowed. I mean, that is also excessive. But maybe that's the best way to do it in these areas. You need more than one viewpoint before you can actually decide that it's a real phenomenon. Okay. Discontent over the many misuses, abuses, and failings of NHST prompted a recent special issue of the American Statistician, the flagship journal of the American Statistical Association, dedicated to moving to a world beyond P being 0.05. The issue includes 43 papers critiquing the status quo of uses of NHST and offering a variety of ways forward, including those outlined above. There is, however, very little collective consensus among the contributors as to what the way forward might be, and debate continues over the proper correctives to the status quo. That's really hard. It's really hard to know what the future of science, especially with a science like psychology, is going to hold. Okay, statistical power. Publication bias and issues of statistical power go hand in hand. Given an effect size and sample size, it is possible to calculate the likelihood of finding a positive result. Psychological science tends to yield small effect sizes based on small samples. This implies not that researchers are exceptionally lucky, but that our published literature is truncated. Thus, critics have pointed to low power alongside p-value near 0.05 and a surprising result as a red flag marking an effect that is unlikely to replicate. Yeah, so maybe the way the studies are set up in general is just too permissive. Furthermore, calls for reform often include injunctions for researchers to set higher minimum standards for sample sizes, thus increasing power, and to report the rationale for their sample sizes with consideration for sufficiently powering the study to detect the predicted effect. Again, this is the hard thing. Getting lots and lots of people on a psych study is difficult, and so this is the reason why psychology has used smaller sample sizes. But then that has got problems too, and maybe they're saying that just like the variability in the sample size is just causing too much leeway for bad behavior. Okay, measurement. Although less prominent than some of the other issues reviewed here, some reformers are calling for a re-evaluation of the rigor and quality of psychological measurement in research. Yeah, what the fuck does measurement mean? Psychological measurement. I mean, are you measuring my brain size again? Several critics, for example, argue that problematic measurement and inattention to measurement error are likely culprits in limiting the replicability of research findings. Likewise, Flick, Peck, and Heyman conducted a review suggesting that recent articles in JPSP provided scant evidence to support the construct validity of the measures the studies employed, and again suggesting that this neglect could contribute to poor replicability. And this is what was saying earlier, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't know how you're measuring stuff, how do you know you got good data to begin with? Although the reform movement has yet to offer substantial correctives to how researchers might better address measurement, the work of Mitchell may prove to be helpful here. In particular, Mitchell argues that psychologists, unlike researchers in many other sciences, have applied numbers to phenomena without empirically demonstrating that they are indeed quantitative phenomena. Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. How do you actually apply numbers to phenomena without demonstrating that they are quantitative phenomena? This happens constantly. This happens in philosophy too, because people like to put numbers on decision theory. And if you ever see me reading a decision theory paper, you will see me harping on this constantly, because they'll be using money, but they won't tell you exactly what denomination it is. So I'll be saying something like I got 3 money and he got 5 money, and we're trying to say there's a big difference between 3 money and 5 money, and it's like you're putting numbers to what people want and like their desires, and they're making decisions on that. And how does 3 money versus 5 money, like it doesn't actually, like, I know it's ungrammatical, I'm saying it that way because I know it doesn't make sense. But like, this is the thing, how do you put numbers, like, are you doing a psych study and you're giving someone $3 and you're giving someone else $5, but like maybe those two people judge the money very differently. It's like one person's a lot poorer than the other person. You have to account for that. But like, if you're doing a large scale study, that's a lot harder. Okay. Mitchell argues that by treating phenomena as quantitative without actually testing the hypotheses that they are, psychologists fail to realize actual scientific measurement and risk distorting and misrepresenting the phenomena they mean to study. Yeah, it is extremely tough. And this is widespread read and rap. And it's also in the philosophy literature, and I love pointing it out because it is such a difficult problem, and people are not taking it as seriously as I think they should. Okay, transparency. One barrier to replication is opacity in methods and analysis. When researchers approach a scientific investigation as if their methods were a secret recipe, then it naturally follows that other labs would be unable to recreate their analyses and test their exact methods. At a minimum, researchers are required to share data with other professionals who wish to verify their analysis. However, even with this data sharing provision included in the APA ethical code, compliance is far from universal. Yeah, people are not always transparent. And even there's certain journals where they can't even publish their stuff. Like, there's like social science journals that like the government, there's restricted journals that the government doesn't publish the data for because, they don't want the data released for whatever reason. Maybe it has to do with like, political parties, all sorts of things. It's not always like bad stuff, but it's just like, it's, private data in some sense. Okay, the obvious antidote is to openly share data, materials, and code used to analyze the data. Easier said than done, of course. Some journals have begun to require this type of sharing as a condition of publication. More commonly, journals have offered a simple acknowledgement of open data, materials, and code using a badge system described earlier. Again, I mean, people like stickers, but like really who gives a fuck when like this is people's lives on the line, like people's jobs and careers. You've got a family to feed. I don't care if I'm getting a badge, if like I get a publication out of it. In the table of context of a journal, an icon representing open data materials and or code appears next to the title of the article if the authors have chosen to share these things. Though a seemingly small nudge, this practice has increased openness. Yeah, because everyone who was doing things good is going to then do it, and everyone who's doing anything bad is not going to. So it's very small, so you're slightly rewarding the people who are doing things right, but it is small, but it's saying it's increased openness, yeah, and that's a good thing, but it's probably all the people that were already not assholes that are willing to just, oh yeah, you want my data, here you go. You're gonna catch it. So maybe that's the thing. Like, it'll be hard. You can go look at the people who don't have the badge, to go look to give them extra scrutiny. But like, given the amount of stuff that's published, it's still not gonna. I mean, is it really going to narrow the field down a lot? I doubt it, but it does narrow down the bad actors maybe a little bit. Okay, so now we're gonna get into the broader theoretical and philosophical issues. I mean, I've been thinking, like, this is a nice paper. Like, I like how they've described everything, laid everything out so far. So it's been pretty good. I mean, I'm going for over an hour. Because, it's long. But let's see. We're at page 19 now. Let's see how much farther we got to go. Yeah. Basically got to almost... Oh, no. We only got to get to go to page 31. So, yeah, we're 2/3 through. Not so bad. I'll live. Hopefully the voice will hold up. Okay. Yeah, they have a decent survey, although it's pre-pandemic. Yeah. This is the thing. It's like, yeah, this is the before times when everyone was like, oh yeah, let's go do science. It'll be good, and everything's just normal. All right. As our previous treatment of the replication crisis suggests, the critiques and reforms arising out of the crisis have been revolutionary in challenging the norms and practices of psychological science, but have perhaps been less revolutionary in terms of their philosophy of science. That is to say, the reform movement has tended not to trace the roots of the replication crisis to the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of our science. Thus, the reform movement could appear to primarily involve methodological belt-tightening that focuses on greater rigor within the received paradigm, rather than searching for and addressing potential problems at a more fundamental level. And we were getting to this in some of what we were saying very early on in this paper, that psychology is, like you're saying, it's a young science and there might be growing pains. There's very end of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, he says something like, we're talking about psychological problems at the moment, but these problems cannot be chalked up to psychology being a young science. There are conceptual problems here that don't make, like, these are conceptual problems that are not like, oh, it's just like youth. No, things don't always make sense here, and there are problems in the philosophy of psychology that need to be called out. The young science. Okay, you get a point for that one, Cinesemiotics. So yeah, so it's not just that it's like a young science and not Jung, Carl, but young Young, young. You get point for probably the best joke of the night there, Cinesemiotics. Okay. There's a sense that this is true, but we worry that this image of reform movement as largely neglectful or of naive or neglectful of or naive to foundational philosophical issues is potentially distorting. Fliss offers a recent analysis that helps make sense of this relative inattention to foundational philosophy, while also highlighting some important ways that the reform movement have been sensitive, at least in pragmatic sense, to some challenges in the philosophical status quo. We offer a brief synopsis of his argument to highlight the philosophical issues that already animate the reform movement, as well as potential points of entry where the work of theoretical and philosophical psychologists may make relevant contributions. According to Fliss, 2019. So this paper is also 2019, so this is kind of a recent thing for them too. It does not make sense to treat these reformers, or most other psychological scientists for that matter, as if they are doing philosophy of science in any formal or traditional sense. Instead, we should understand their work as being informed by an indigenous epistemology, a kind of bottom-up conception of what science is and who scientists are that is informed by researchers' own experiences and practices as psychological scientists themselves, rather than by a careful study and application of philosophy of science. That's right. No scientists have studied philosophy of science, or not like in rigor. If they've done it, it's not like they are philosophers of science, because that's a whole discipline on its own, and they are not as aligned as you might assume that a scientist and a philosopher of scientist might be. Some of them are, but most of them are. The philosophers are the philosophers of scientists, and the scientists are scientists, and the philosophers of science are the philosophers, mostly, although there is some overlap. But the scientists definitely are not philosophers, and the philosophers are definitely not scientists. Fliss further argues that because the subject matter of psychology also bears on the psychology of scientists themselves, these conceptions are likewise shaped by an understanding that researchers are presumably also susceptible to the many biases that psychological research on human reasoning over the last 50 years has revealed. You think they have to be more aligned? Did we solve the replication crisis? Yes, you just missed it. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go back over it though. And they don't talk to each other, so frustrating. Yeah, they don't talk to each other. I once saw a philosopher. I'll just tell you who it was. It was Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, whatever. He's a philosophy of biology guy, and he also has like advanced degrees, like PhDs in both biology and philosophy of biology, a philosopher. And he said he thought at one point that he would, do both, and like people would be like super happy with him because he could talk about both. And it turns out no one was happy with him because they wanted him to either be solely a biologist or solely a philosopher, and this sort of hybrid thing, people were not happy with him. And it surprised him, but that's really what the sociology of the disciplines want. They want you to be a hardcore biologist or a hardcore philosopher, and this sort of doing both thing didn't. He said it just like it surprised him. He thought it would be like people would be super happy, and it wasn't the case. You think philosophy of science should be a requirement for all philosophy of science and grad students? The philosophers always say that, and then it's not going to happen. I mean, it's like, yes, people should be better educated. I've run into this myself being in two fields, says Shane. Yeah, it's an interesting part of academia and like science and multiple fields. Yeah, so it's mostly sociology, people getting mad at your history side. Yeah, and like I don't know exactly, like there's no like universal thing here, like why are some people more angry about this than others, but like yeah, there's something sociologically about like different disciplines getting like trying to protect their like boundaries or something, and they don't like it. They bring out this big interpretation. I go, well, that doesn't hold up over time. Wow. Yeah. So like I think it's like this sort of like a disciplinary like protection. Like they want to like protect what their kind of like special knowledge. Like no, like you're saying like history doesn't bear that out, but they're saying, well, I'm a sociologist and this is what the sociology tells me. And so it's like I feel like people want to have like a special knowledge, and like that's discipline based, and like they know something, and so I feel like there's something to that, but again, what the fuck are people doing being like saying, well, it's like obviously like we've got evidence, historical evidence that this doesn't actually work, and it's like, well, people don't want to hear that. Yeah, protective custody of knowledge. That's a good way of putting it. It's probably the right way of saying it too. I couldn't remember the term. So I feel like there's something to that. Yeah, that's exactly right. Guilds, clubs, yeah. So people are, and sometimes in the past, like you don't, like I did martial arts when I was a kid. And like you'd hear stories like, ooh, there's like, like in the movies, like there's the people, like there's the 5-point exploding heart technique that the great master doesn't teach. That's a thing. People guard their knowledge very, very like rigorously. Yeah, you call it ivory tower bullshit, but that's a more socially accepted term. Well, it's not just ivory tower. Like I said, the martial arts, they hid their knowledge because for whatever reason, but like they want to be like the master, or maybe it was just because the government would be angry with them. Who knows? Institutional unionism, trafficking, and information. Yeah, that too. Which tends to stem from elitism, protectionism of ego. Yeah, I think there's a bunch of ego involved, but there's always a bunch of ego involved in academia. Nintendo, what's up? How you doing? I hope you're doing well. Totally different epistemologies for these different fields. That's part why they can't talk to each other fruitfully. Yes, that's true too. Different methodology, and so people don't appreciate what other people are saying. That's a good point. So yeah, they don't appreciate that there is knowledge being generated through different methodologies in different fields. Yeah. So these are the things. So there's a bunch of this stuff. And it's an interesting way the authors put it right here. They're calling it indigenous epistemology. So, yeah. Another reason for everyone to learn philosophy of science? Yeah. Well, Shane, let me give you something about the word true. In philosophy, you have to, you can work on the concept of truth, but no one has a damn clue what actually is true in the end. And so in philosophy, that gets very dangerous to be like, well, this is true. Like, I can't actually make that claim. I can never make the claim that anything I say is true. Like, it's just going to get beaten down. So it's like, this is one of these funny things. Like, that might work in other areas, but I can't actually use the word true most of the time. Yeah, who's truth? Yeah, well, nitpick zone, yeah. Well, yeah, it's like, there's a few things I have to bite the bullet on. It's like, yeah. That's one of them. It's like I'm gonna be pretentious sometimes. I'm a philosopher, and I'm gonna nitpick about like philosophical terms. Yeah. Do we even have a formalized consensus on what science even is? No. There's a demarcation problem of science and pseudoscience. Yeah. You can actually go look that one up. I think it is just called the demarcation problem of science. You appreciate the sharpening? Well, it's interesting. It's in some sense that we use the terms differently. And I don't think when you're using it wrongly or maliciously or anything like that. But I have to use it in a very specific way. And so, yeah, I have to use it in maybe a sharper way than you do. And so it's like, you're not wrong when you use it, but I'm using it very specifically because I got to be careful. And, Valpo's here is philosopher of Aristotle is here, philosopher. They will you can almost see it sometimes when someone says something a little bit funny. One of them, I don't know if you'll notice it, but you'll see the comments show up every so often. When there's an actual a technical philosopher around, you'll see the comments show up. You get called out for saying something half wrong, or at least I do it. I know maybe I'm just projecting. So. But yeah, because we're using things slightly differently, it's like, you got to be careful about that. Anywho, yeah, indigenous epistemology addresses the claim that scientists, because they are human, are prone to behave irrationally. Not necessarily irrationally, but it's domain specific. And thus scientific systems should be established to hold these irrational tendencies in check. But see, again, this is what we were just talking about. Domain specific knowledge means that maybe you can do something a little bit different in different areas. Yeah, he is so good. Exactly. Reading rap. He's amazing at certain things, like this, social interactions online. He's super intuitive. It's great. Better than I am on many of these fronts. Okay. However, although science is taken as a system to provide the rules and norms for applying logic and rationality to claims of truth and evidence, Fliss notes that reformers are concerned that this application is socially mediated and instituted, and can thus be socially constructed in ways that assimilate and reward some of the very biases they hope science would change. Yeah, because who's doing it? It's people with these biases are trying to change it to the way they think it is, and this is why there's always these disagreements about this stuff. I've told this story before. I'll tell again just because it's so much fun. When I was an undergrad, they were rewriting the school like charter or like constitution or something. Yeah, Iris says it. Camp Valpo says different skill set than mine. Yours is good too. Yeah, I mean, he does a different area of philosophy. He's amazing. It's fine. I do different stuff. It's good. Rephrased, if epistemological reasoning is sound and the data I'm using as a base was derived in proper, replicable, and controlled means, then you have a deal. Yeah, see, again, if like once you get more specific, then you can do it. And then you have to hash out exactly what proper, replicable, and controlled means. But like that's fine. But like yeah, it can be done. But like that's the thing. Once you get into philosophy, then you have to break down truth into these things because you're gonna say, well, what do you mean exactly by that? And then you can list these things, and then you can argue about that crap, and it goes on forever. But like what I was just saying is that this is a fun story, like a little aside. At the hour and 40-minute mark in this paper. So they were discussing what to put into the school charter, and the person in charge of the school at the time was a philosopher, and so he called all the philosophers that he liked or were into this stuff. So you got political philosophers and like metaphysicians and like people history, philosophy, a bunch of those people, and then he also got all the top people out of the political science department. So you've got a room of people who know what the fuck happens when you write down shit on paper. Who put a philosopher in charge? The guy was a complete asshole. Don't worry. We all hated him. And so he he was a Kantian, and you may have heard me and Aris, like, we just hate Kantian philosophy, and Kantians quite often are nice people, but yeah, some of them when they go bad, they're bad. Yeah, he was conservative dipshit sometimes. So, but like he wasn't stupid. So he got all like these like really smart people in the room and to rewrite the thing, and like, how do we actually write this so like this actually can be used as a way to, and Shane, you'll appreciate this. If it was a constitution, how is this document going to help the university going forward? And so the only person in the room was the vice chancellor. This guy was the chancellor, and there was a vice chancellor, and he was from some other department. And so this guy, this vice chancellor, keeps saying, well, we need to put truth in the charter somewhere. And everyone was like, okay, we'll get to that later. Don't worry about it. Kant is fine and actually good as long as you don't play it out to the ultimate end. Well, that's true about all the philosophers. You can't play out all of them. Everything goes wrong in the end. If you haven't noticed, nothing has gotten out of this stream scot-free. Nothing. Every paper I get to it has problems. So this guy, they're rewriting the thing, and this guy keeps, bringing up truth. I want truth to be written into this thing, and they keep punting. And eventually the guy gets annoyed. He's like, no, we need to talk about this now. Like, let's get this in before, gets late. And he's like getting angry, and everyone keeps like, this is like an important person in the university. All the professors can't really tell the guy to shut up, and the chancellor's just been sitting there like, whatever. And eventually the guy's angry, and the guy just goes, all right, sorry, dude, it's not happening. Because anytime you put words like truth in these documents, shit breaks. It's the first thing that people who want to abuse it harp on. They say they have the truth, and because no one actually knows what the truth is, that's exactly how the assholes get in. That's how they fuck with you. They get these big terms, and then they claim it for themselves, and that's what happens time and time again. But like they just said, it's not happening, shut up. And like this is how it played out in the university I went to. So, but like, and it was funny because like the guy just had to say, he just put his foot down and be like, nah, not happening. Okay. And this is why I harp on truth sometimes, Shane, and because you can probably verify where do constitutions go wrong over time. You will refer to a more perfect union in lieu of a perfect union. Yeah, So this is the thing. What does perfect mean? Like, and that's the thing. If it was perfect, that's exactly the point. Perfect, no one has a damn clue. More perfect, maybe you can work on. But, like, again, what the fuck does perfect mean in this? Well, union has a technical thing. In the case of the United States, like, it's a union of whatever, like, different, what does what mean? Okay, I'm just going down that path. What the what? But yeah. But the real problem in the sentence is the perfect, because you can define the existential crisis activated. Yeah, because perfection is you're gonna get into metaphysical claims about like what perfections are, and at that point, all bets are off. Yeah, so people are they put in bias that they hope science would challenge, but people are people, and they're not going to realize they're biased because that is what a bias is. Okay, this is an important point for the reformers because it highlights not only the fact that problematic bias may creep into scientific practice and discourse, but that it may also usurp a false legitimacy by presenting problematic forms of logic and rationality in ways that appear to have held such bias in check given their scientific status. Yeah, see, if you encode it into the Constitution, then it's not a check, it's a legitimation at that point of the bias, and that's bad. Thus, for reformers, it is not sufficient to merely reform the systems of logic and probability in scientific practice. Instead, they argue the reform must also address those social systems and norms that frame the use of such logic and probability, such as the incentive systems built into the publication, hiring, and advancement and funding. Well, yeah, see, this is the problem. Are you going to change everything all at once? Like, that's impossible, too. It's, like, super hard. But whatever. Nevertheless, Fliss argues these stances leave reformers committed to a problematic pluralism that points to a fundamentally social conception of science in their framing of the problems of the replication crisis, while still holding to a mid-20th century post-positivist ideal of scientific methodology that in many ways contradicts and resists the social vision of science. Yeah, see, this is the thing. If you've got these, like, sort of positivistic things, going back to the positivists of the 30s, this is why it's post-positivist. It's from, like, post-war, the mid-century. Ideals of, like, the progress of science. But that may not be that science actually progresses in the way you think it will, and that's the problem with this. That things are not progressing the way they thought it would. And you're holding on to these old ideals that got us into this problem in the beginning. On the one hand, there are irrationalist indigenous epistemology, so this is the localized knowledge, points toward the deeply social, contextual, and fundamentally uncertain understandings of science seen in the post-Kuhnian era, perhaps best represented in the history and sociology of science movements. On the other hand, reformers tend to prescribe practices that remain within a received view of the scientific method as a bounded rationality of hypothesis formation, testing, reporting, and theory assimilation, more consistent with the positivist and post-positivist models driving Popperian and hypothetico-deductive methodologies. Okay, if people have questions about that stuff, this is pretty standard philosophy of science, being like, okay, we come up with a hypothesis, we test it, and then given the results, we, either move on to other questions or, like, refine our hypothesis to fit in more with what the results looked like that we got. Fliss notes that a majority of reforms, in spite of their calls for social and normative corrections have tended instead to emphasize greater rigor in methodological and statistical practices that are more reminiscent of the methodological orthodoxy that provided a coherence and unity to psychological science in the latter half of the 20th century. Here, Fliss argues reformers would be well served by revising their outdated notion of science from the visions of Hempel, Lakatos, and others, and to move instead toward models that emphasize the social and historical contingency of science, such as those put forth by Latour and Kuhn. Again, this is like, where do you think the future of science is going? Now, Fliss thinks Latour and Kuhn, but maybe they'll go back the other way. I'm not sure. Like, that's a good question, though. Who actually has the right vision for the future of science? And that's a hard question. Okay, along with Fliss, we see tensions within the reform movement that, in spite of a tendency toward post-positivist views of science, nevertheless point toward a potential openness to issues that are also of concern to many theoretical and philosophical psychologists. That is to say, the loosening of orthodoxies that the crisis has engendered, alongside reformers' concern with the social structures of psychological science may suggest a greater openness and receptivity to non-positivist alternatives that more fundamentally reimagine psychological science. We offer here a brief sketch of several areas familiar to theoretical and philosophical psychologists where we see implications for and possibilities for engagement with the reform movement. All right, so that's interesting. I mean, it scares the fucking hell out of science when you say you're scientists, when you say you're going to change the science, though. And so this is, in some sense, even though there's like a systemic change here we're talking about earlier, changing the idea of science scares these people, because they don't want to hear that, like, they don't understand science, which is, they don't want to do it. Like, trust me. Shane says, what about Malcolm's law of science? That science will never stop to think about whether or not they should do something, just throw everything into figuring out if they could. That is an interesting law. But it's been said before, actually. Firebend, who didn't get mentioned here, was this guy who opposed some of these people here. And his he was famous because he said anything goes in the history of science. And the idea is basically Lakatos was saying anything goes, that you can do. They will try, scientists will use methodology that you don't think will work. Oh, it's a real law from Jurassic Park. Ian Malcolm, I'm an asshole. Oh, okay. I love it, that movie. That's one of my favorite movies. Yeah. Never stopped to because you get, and one of the greatest lines, Firebend. Okay, yeah, I apologize. I do not know how to say Firebend. You get Ian Malcolm pulling on the he says he asked the philosophical ethical question. They were so interested into thinking that they could, that they did not think that if they could, they did not think if they should. Yeah, there we go. You just could not say it. You're half German. There you go. Yeah, I couldn't. I'm reading like every other word at this point. And so I screwed up the Malcolm law of science. Geez, now I feel dumb because that was exactly what should have been said. I appreciate learning how to say some of these people's names, because what just happens is I end up embarrassing myself later. Like when I'm talking to other people and they're like, "It's Feyerabend." I'm like, "Okay, I'm sorry." So it's better I learn sooner. Well, it's better I learn whenever I learn. So yeah, Ian Malcolm. I should have got that one, but 2 hours in and like brain starts going. Okay, but let's go see it. And like I said, no one wants to hear that they don't understand their business, and that you're gonna come in and tell them how they're doing their shit. So you're not gonna go in and tell some scientist, look, you're not actually doing science the right way. No one wants to hear that shit. No one wants to hear that you're coming in and telling them how the way the world is when it's like their life. Okay. Theoretical and philosophical psychology has a long tradition of challenging the received approach to psychology and offering alternative visions for psychological science grounded in wholly different ontologies and epistemologies. Theories rooted in phenomenology, hermeneutics, critical theory, and feminist epistemology, to name just a few, offer radical alternatives that upend and replace the ontological and epistemological commitments of traditional mainstream psychology. These various approaches have the potential to offer fruitful accounts of how problems identified by performers may actually arise. Which is weird, right? Because most of our work is in writing. Yeah, it's true. Cinesemiotics. It's like most of the stuff is in writing, and then I talk to somebody and I realize I've never said someone's name, and I'm like, God, I gotta say this name, and I don't know if I'm gonna butcher it. Yeah. These various approaches have the potential to offer fruitful accounts of how the problems identified by performers may actually arise, at least in part, from the philosophical systems that have grounded them, and thus be better addressed by alternative visions of what science is and who scientists are. It is beyond the scope of this paper to satisfactorily unpack the various shapes that these accounts may take, but we will highlight in the sections that follow a few of the rich possibilities that such alternatives may provide. And although these alternative perspectives each have much to offer, we would argue that the reform movement may be most receptive to and find most useful the elements of these theories that emphasize the social nature of the practice of science. Not only are these elements already salient to reformers who seek the social, political, and economic forces surrounding the practice of psychological science as key culprits in the replication crisis, but they also may provide a point of entry for other critiques that challenge the special status of methodological orthodoxy. Semyak says, we should all adapt personal emoticons and then act indignant when they are mispronounced. You know, this is one of the things about Twitch. Emotes. Like, you can get so many different, like, little emotions out of, like, this stuff. And you can get, like, very specific modifications of them. And people will understand what you say. And then you have specific emotes to, like, different communities. And then when those emotes are used within that community, they're used in a specific way and they have a specific meaning. And so, like, there is a whole thing about this that, like, is, like, online culture and Twitch in particular, and, like, Discord for that matter, particular. And so there's an interesting thing that's going on right with what you're saying and, like, right now, like, using this stuff. Because you've got, like, the not like this, you've got, like, this guy face, like, what the fuck does this guy face actually mean? I always forget. But, like, it gets used in all sorts of different things. So, like, you got fucking symbolic interactionist. Yeah. So, but, like, this is part of the thing about Twitch. So, like, who knows? It's like, what? So, yeah. And so then you get, like, you know, why? Let's see. What do I have? Like, so I've got this one right here. Okay. Here we go. So this is Dan Creep. Yeah. Dan M Creep. Then Daniel Matt. And so it's like, but I mean, it's like, you learn that the hard way. Yeah. Akon Mommy. Wow. Okay. Yeah, so this is the thing. So, like, all these things, it all matters. But okay. What's interesting here, I like these authors right here. They're picking and choosing things out of the philosophy that they think will actually fly. So I like them for this. Because, like I said, no one wants to hear the shit the philosophers want to tell them. They're like, don't be telling me my business. But if the philosophers pick and choose things that they're already going to like and be able to glom onto, that's smart. Because then that'll give people an entry point into the philosophy. Where before they're going to defend their little domain-specific knowledge as opposed to from the philosophy. Except if you can give them more tools to use, then that's a good thing. Bye, friends. Oh, yeah, yep. Everyone go hang out with Anne. I'll give Anne another shout out. Yeah, go shoot things, Anne. Have fun. All the hottest new sociologists have lots of papers for you to read and talk about personal symbols. They just don't know they are going to have to end up postmodern if they keep going. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks again for being here. And yeah, but there's something definitely interesting about the emotes and all this stuff, but I forget how we got onto that. But again, domain specific knowledge, I think. Yeah. And so this is the whole thing. How do you talk about certain ideas in certain areas? And then there's like, well, you can do it with pictures, and then Alex made a comment. Okay. Critique of objectivism. The reform movement has been much less critical of the basic tenets of objectivist epistemologies. Instead, reformers tend to see the problems of the replication crisis as a failure of scientists in working towards objectivist ideals. Objectivism particularly stands prominent in reformers' general expectation that better methodological practices will more adequately check and manage, if not eliminate, researchers' human biases. For this reason, the reform movement has emphasized incremental improvement through adjustment in methods and practices rather than a more fundamental critique of psychology's philosophical foundations. Interesting. So they're saying they think we're moving towards objective ends, but that may not be the case. Okay. However, we would argue that the critiques of objectivism that come out of many theoretical and philosophical schools of thought, as well as the non-objectivist alternatives they advance, may be particularly helpful in making sense of the replication crisis. Specifically, these non-objectivist approaches may well be suited to unpack the ways that this unquestioned commitment to objectivism may in fact be integral to the present crisis. Nintendo Famicom, I wasn't here from the start. What's the reform movement? Okay, there's people that want to, update the way psychology and psychological sciences are done because of the replication crisis. So the way they're using it here is just the people who are interested in shaking things up a bit in various ways to, prevent regain some sort of confidence in psychology. So these are reformers who are looking to, change psychology to make it, have more confidence in the results so that there won't be a future replication crisis. So that's just how it's getting used here. Okay. So specifically exactly. What counts as the right kind of rigor? Specifically, these non-objectivist approaches may well be suited to unpack the ways that this unquestioned commitment to objectivism may in fact be integral to the present crisis. Critiques of objectivism have highlighted the ways that a commitment to objectivism does not remove bias or values from research in spite of its promise to approach such an ideal, but instead tends to simply obscure the fact of biases and values under the cloak of objectivity. Yet philosophers of science generally agree that some degree of values are inescapable in science, giving rise to both minimalist approaches that try to limit science to epistemic values, as well as value-laden approaches that reject the possibility that values can or should be limited and constrained. Either of these positions, nevertheless, stand in contrast to a naive objectivism that treats values and biases as inherently problematic while striving for an unbiased perspective. However, this bias against biases cannot help but elevate at least that one bias, which likely opens the door to more rampant bias. The conclusion critics draw is that objectivist discourses end up endorsing a wide range of values and biases, for example, fairness, fallibility, humility, justice, while simultaneously claiming to overcome bias. Thus, these hidden values and biases operate unexamined and unchecked in a discourse that risks leaving its interlocutors insensitive and inarticulate to the ways values are actually operating in science and other domains. I think this is a really good point, actually. When people assume they're being objective and that it's like being taken care of by the system, that basically gives them free reign to do bad things if they are clever enough with how they frame their argument. They're saying, oh, I'm just doing science, I'm not being racist. But like, this is exactly how you get racist work. You're saying, oh, I'm just following the science and like, don't ask me, I'm just doing the science. But like, if you look at it, like, it's super racist, but like, they're using it as a defense, and they're like, well, if it wasn't racist, it would just, the science would, push it out. And that's the thing, you're using this sort of thing as a cloak, and it's not true, because it's just, you're ignoring the biases and calling it science. But that's because the blind, the sort of the simplistic version is too simplistic. So, okay. It may be mainstream psychology's commitment to this sort of objectivism is responsible, at least in part, for QRP's questionable research practices and similar problems becoming so prevalent in the field, because adherence to methodological norms was assumed to tap into a scientific logic that could check researcher bias and provide relative objectivity. Researchers were much less likely to question research that appeared to adhere to such norms. Thus, signaling conformity to methodological norms could lend researchers the legitimacy of objectivity without drawing critical attention to either the objectivist values that lend them legitimacy nor to those values that might otherwise challenge practices. Yeah, a little less cloak, a little more dagger. That's what it's always a little bit, that's always it's what's that old song? Well, let's talk a little bit more action. Yeah, exactly. Although the efforts of reformers to bring greater methodological rigor to the norms of psychological science may still be worthwhile, we worry that merely relying upon a reformed methodological orthodoxy that remains committed to objectivism could risk creating new blind spots, once again obscured by a quest to leave bias behind. Challenging objectivism in the reform movement could invite an ongoing and continual examination of the values and biases that drive our science, with the goal of being toward embracing those values that best serve our science rather than aspiring to an impossible value freedom. In this sense, such a challenge might treat the self-evaluation and creative reform of the current movement as fundamental features of science itself, rather than as a temporary state of turmoil to be stabilized with methodological rigor. And this is exactly the trouble I was alluding to earlier. When you're challenging the fundamental features of science itself, people are going to react badly, and so this is going to take some finessing, because people are not going to like that the idea that science cannot self-correct. You'd have to sell this to them. You couldn't just tell them that, oh, you're being objective, this is the wrong theory, and like this will help you out. This is not going to work in the current form. You'd have to sell this. This might be true, this might be what we have to do, but like this won't sell as is. No one wants to hear that they are methodologically confused. They're like, no, I'm science. I readjust as I need. Like, I'm smart. I know what I'm doing. But it's like, it's a philosophical readjustment. But no one wants to hear that shit. Trust me. So I think the authors are right, but like this has to be packaged differently. In addition to drawing attention and debate to the values driving psychological science, non-objectivist approaches may also provide richer forms of discourse for addressing transparency and accountability. The reform movement has generally held up transparency as a virtue in reforming the problems of the replication crisis. Transparency discourses often tap into similar logics to objectivism, suggesting that there is a transparent view that objectively reveals and thus can potentially check any problematic biases and values. And in this sense, it is not surprising that so many reforms would value transparency. Transparency, from this view, merely provides a reasonable accountability and promotes good behavior. We actually read something recently where they were saying transparency is not good. Transparency is basically a panopticon, and basically whoever is controlling what counts as transparency, their biases become ubiquitous. Whoever is deciding what needs to be transparent and what isn't, that is even more dangerous than just the claim of transparency. So you have to also be really careful who's claiming for transparency. And this is the thing about her emails, or like Trump saying, oh, I'm going to have the most transparent administration ever, and then completely not doing that, because it's used as a way to ram biases down people's throats quite often. So you got to be super careful whoever's talking about transparency. Greenvap says, so would this analysis technically fall under the macro category of metascience? Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what metascience means nowadays. It's started to grow as a term, but like I would assume so. I mean, this is not in a philosophy. This is in a journal of theoretic psychology. So, like, this is definitely talking big picture. This is not like psychological research here. You can't seem to get a formalized working understanding of what constitutes metascience in its basic form. It seems like philosophy or science. Yeah, this is the problem. It's a newer term. It's getting used more, and in the last few years, and people have actually asked me this before on stream, and I was like, oh, I don't know. There is a journal, Metascience, but that's not what it's an older journal before the term came around. It's actually a review journal putting out reviews of articles. And so, yes, it's a meta thing, but it's not meta science. I don't actually know. And it's a good question. I'd like to know how people are using the term meta science nowadays. But yeah, I was like, well, look at this philosophy journal on meta science. But I was like, nah, it was not what the person was talking about. That was a while ago. I don't even remember what that was. That was like a year and a half ago, 2 years. Victor Sor, welcome in. How you doing? Maybe it's ironically my personal bias. I think one of the largest issues is that in literature reviews, there is not the usage of formal logic, which, as I'm sure you know, is meant to remove personal bias from reasoning. Yeah. Again, it depends how skilled you are at what you do, because if you're very clever with your logic, you can do many, many, many things. But, yeah, it's like they should be using accepted standards. Maybe formal logic is a little too heavy-handed for particular sciences, but like there should be some good philosophical tools, some sort of boundaries and like systems we could use. But again, who gets to set those up, and are you sure those are not gonna have like hidden biases in them? And because quite often, like, you can't just get people to use just like, break everything down to if P then Q. That's not going to work for most of the things we're doing from a practical point of view, and also from a theoretical point of view. It's very hard to do. So it's like, it's just not going to practically work. Beyond using logic from a foundational standpoint, I think it should always be used from a coherent standpoint to reach the same conclusion in multiple ways. Yeah, I think that's perfectly acceptable there. Like, you should be able to make it, if you're doing science, it should be coherent. You can't have like contradictory science. Like, that's not what goes on in science. So that's fair. But like, again, how do you actually cash that out to get the scientists to have like a methodology that they can just apply? It's a lot harder to do that in practice. And I guess, and that's kind of what's going on here. And that's why I keep criticizing them. It's like, this shit's not going to fly when you start to tell them that like the fundamental features of science themselves are not what they thought they were, because people ain't going to hear that shit when that's like their job every day. It's like, don't be telling me what my job is. I've been doing this for 30 fucking years and I do it every day and I've been like super successful and I have the fucking, you know, research to back me up. Like, I did do good things. So it's like, you can't tell people that like they're wrong about this. They're not wrong about it. So you have to sell that. You have to show a way to get it to be sold better. You think you've been able to inculcate formal logic in your literature reviews to reach some inferences that others have missed. My field is social psychology and my minor BA's degree of philosophy. See, that's excellent that you can do it, but the problem is, like, that's you can do it. It can be done and you can do it. The problem is to get everyone out there, your understanding of things is going to be like, that's why it's difficult. They're not going to accept, or they're not going to put the time that you have put the time in, because, you know, they were out there busy doing the science. And so changing people's minds like in that way is super difficult. It's just like, this is the problem. How do you get people to change the way they're thinking about stuff? This is an uphill battle. Absolutely, read and rap. Yeah, well, see, they say from this view merely provides a reasonable count on good behavior. It's tough. Victor Soros says your master's thesis, you were able to find discrepancy that accounted for a long-held and unresolved debate between two sides of a debate over the nature of personal construct. Yeah, I mean, that's great. Like, that's amazing. But like, that's the thing. It took a smart person writing a, you know, master's thesis is not a short paper. So it's like someone had to put a bunch of time in to find one of these problems. Now, could we get people to do science better so we did not get discrepancies? Yes. But again, that's an institutional and systemic problem. How do we get people everywhere to act in a certain way that doesn't fuck up? These are people we're talking about, remember? I mean, they're very smart people, they're hardworking people, but they're still people. And that's really what we've been talking about this whole paper. How do you get people that we thought were doing a useful, smart, good program, and then it ended up failing in the replication crisis? So, okay. 6 more pages. However, non-objectivist approaches suggest that, yeah, agreed. The sad truth is that current field of psychology does not value formal logic as it should. Lots of places don't. It's not just a psychologist. Formal logic. Okay. However, non-objectivist approaches suggest that transparency is a value like any other, and as such, necessarily illuminates and obscures and can be put into nefarious purposes. Strathern, for example, argues that transparency practices never fully reveal, but instead offer displays that are intended to signal and reveal truth, and as such can be manipulated to give false signals. Oh, this is what I was complaining about. That conceal as much as they reveal. Perhaps the classical example of transparency that obscures is the use of standardized testing in public education as a way of shining light on the quality of teaching and learning. As many teachers and educational researchers can attest, the scrutiny and reductionistic scope of standardized tests leads to pressure for teachers to teach to the test, a practice that could distort what the tests are intended to reveal and could disrupt otherwise sound teaching practices. Likewise, many teachers report that practices such as standardized testing operate more as surveillance systems than as a transparent view on the quality of their work. This is one of the points I was saying, that's like kind of a panopticon, depending, and who controls it. Again, what they were saying of who actually controls this stuff is really what is going on. Like, what are you looking for? It's like everyone complains about the business people in charge of like kids' education, but that's exactly it. They're looking for standardized tests so that there's good numbers. But again, who is looking and what are they looking at? It's terrible. Similarly, efforts to improve transparency in psychology may inadvertently create new standards and metrics which are no less gameable than prior standards. Even a seemingly unassailable value like transparency can be distorted from the well-meaning improvements that reformers hope to achieve. The complexity that these critiques bring to transparency discourses could help not only better refine the reform approaches to transparency, but could also facilitate addressing the pushback that some reformers have received from researchers who object to the ways they are being scrutinized. Victor says, what you're talking about would be such valuable pursuit in my opinion. Writing that is geared towards the inculcation of formal logic in real-world practice, a very difficult uphill battle, I think, caused so many fields are stooped in at times in sorts of dogmatic beliefs. Yeah, I mean, we're not that far out of like people were, every point in history, every single one is at the cutting edge of history for those people. And we think, well, we're so much better than the people in the past. It's just not true. We are better a little bit worse sometimes, but like everyone's trying their best, but like we're not that far out of like, we're only a few hundred years out of like the Middle Ages, really. It's like a completely different mindset about the world. And I'm not like making fun of them. I'm just saying it's like very different than where we are right now. And not even in all things, just like some things. But like it is a very different world than it was not that long ago. And you can go to just different parts of our world right now and people think very differently than you will. So everything's easier said than done. Yeah, Shane, that's right. Fancier ways to fuck the world up is basically it. So, but like the history of philosophy is very slow, and Shane knows history, and these things, the world is slow moving. I said truth, oh no. Well, yeah, and I'm talking about bad things. We're talking about bad things at this point. Oh. Okay. Many of... oh, you meant Victor? Okay. Many of the... Oh, we were all talking about bad things at that point. Many of the objections to the reform movement highlights sensitivities to perceived overreaching and monitoring, but the objections primarily address this in terms of tone and civility. Many reformers often worry that this tone debate sidesteps the substance of their critiques, shifting from a debate of scientific and methodological norms to one of interpersonal norms. Well, see, this is the problem. People talk about tone debate when they don't want to hear what the fuck you're saying. This is what I mean. This is exactly what happens. This is exactly the problem. They're talking about tone when the real problem is they don't want to hear this shit. Well, no, Victor, I was ranting, I think, before you were here that I don't like the word true. It gets abused too much over the course of history. So I think it was just, you might have missed that discussion, and it was me being like, don't talk to me about the truth in philosophy. I was just like, I don't want to hear it. It's just rampant abuse over time. Yeah. So this is the thing, and this is the confusion right here. People actually don't realize that like you can't be telling people that they don't understand their own business. Okay. It may be that both sides of the tone debate are relatively inarticulate in considering the darker sides of transparency and in even considering transparency as a value that could be questioned. However, if values such as transparency and accountability are not taken for granted, but instead addressed critically in tension with other scientific values and biases, then the debate may be better able to address both the objections and reforms. And see, this is showing its age. This is pre-pandemic and Trump times where these... things really didn't quite come to the head yet in the last few years, because this was probably written in 2017, 2018, and these things were only starting to be like really big social things where you're talking about like transparency in government and stuff. So they may have got a taste of it in the world, but at this point, like, they haven't got like the full on like, oh my god, the scientists are lying to us bullshit yet. Okay. Such a discourse could accommodate the potential virtues that the reform movement sees in openness, transparency, and accountability, while weighing the potential abuses that surveillance systems can entail as critiques of neoliberalism, new managerialism, and industrialism from theoretical psychologists have articulated. You see, the things that they could have been referencing, 2017 is recent for them, but 2015 is like, at this point, is ancient when it comes to this shit. This approach also can bridge concerns over focus on methodological and scientific norms versus interpersonal norms, highlighting the ways that methodological transparency practices are simultaneous with interpersonal values such as trust and accountability. Again, things we talked a lot more about in the news after this paper. Universalism. Implicit in most conventional understandings of replication is some form of universalism. The idea that reality is underlain with fundamental universal laws, principles, and truths, and that these truths are unchangeable from one situation to the next. Although theories may fail to capture the complexity of these theories and thus have limited application across contexts, universalism would suggest that the processes underlying contextual variations are nevertheless the result of fundamental universal laws that theories aspire to represent. This sort of universalism is common in concepts of generalizability and external validity, premised on the notion that what ought to concern us most in psychological science are those things that are consistent from one context to the next, as well as the contingencies that presumably constrain this consistency. The assumption here is that this consistency is rooted in a fundamental sameness or universality of the phenomenon to be generalized. These standards of generalizability suggest that the effect that we observe in one study should not only be reproducible in other studies, but such reproducibility is taken as evidence for the reality of an effect as it conforms more closely to this ideal of universalism. Conversely, if an effect is real but efforts to replicate fail, universalism would suggest that this failure is likely due to an insensitivity to those universals that dictate how a phenomenon might operate differently from one context to the next, necessitating, for example, increased theoretical complexity, tests of a variety of auxiliary assumptions, etc. Okay, so now they're arguing that, like, sometimes science needs to be not universal. Like, there is something special in different areas that need to be, like, cordoned off from other areas. Okay. However, renewed attention to the replication in the reform movement has highlighted the importance of particularity in the psychological science. So yeah, this is like an interesting thing. We're going to go for particularity here. As reformers have attempted to provide norms and standards for direct replication, it has quickly become apparent that every replication necessarily involves some degree of deviation from the original study. At the very least, a replication must occur at a different point in time, and it very likely will include different participants. And in reality, even those studies that are still considered direct or close replications will vary in myriad other ways, however small. We were talking about how difficult it is to, replicate any study, and so there's always going to be something. Thus, the distinction between direct and conceptual replication becomes somewhat blurred, a matter of degrees, requiring some judgment as to whether a replication has included all of the crucial elements of a study to qualify as a true replication. Yeah, it's like, so exactly what sort of variables are you measuring for, but what about all the other things that go into the study, like that could have also been affecting things? This challenge in designing replications that rhetorically satisfy the universalistic demand for sufficient sameness highlights the inescapable inferential leap involved in drawing conclusions about the replicability or non-replicability of an effect. All right, I just want to note that this was a massive sentence with a lot of big words in it, and I said it. That is to say, inasmuch as these conclusions pertain to the presence or non-presence of a universal effect, however admittedly qualified such claims may be regarding the conditions to which it may universally apply, they go beyond the evidence of the particular studies in inferring that replication effects are not only similar but are actually the same thing. And this is a great point, because similarity and being the exact same thing ain't always the case. So like this actually the same thing right here. So like these two things, like that they're actually the same thing. It's like, what does that actually mean? That is like, this is a bit of a, always going to be an abstraction. We were talking about this earlier. Always some sort of abstraction here. And what does it actually mean that these two things are the same? The challenge in drawing these inferences has incited debate in the reform movement, particularly regarding when researchers can satisfactorily conclude from replication findings that an effect is or is not real. Thus, in their conclusion to the report on the RPP, the Open Science Collaboration stated, after this intensive effort to reproduce a sample of published psychological findings, how many of the effects have we established are true? 0. How many of the effects have we established are false? 0. Their defense to uncertainty was due at least in part to their sensitivity to the fact that their replications could not conclusively satisfy the ideal of universalism that would allow them to be more decisive. I mean, but the question, of course, here is how standard is. Even in physics, you can't ever replicate anything because you can't go back in time and do the same experiment in the past when at the same place the other people were. There ain't no, but you have to be able to abstract away from that. In physics, it's an atemporal science. All times are supposed to be the same. You can go forward in time and backwards in time in physics. But can you do that in other stuff? Maybe, maybe not. Like, maybe certain things are sociologically or temporally based in certain societies. So it's very hard to actually understand what counts as an abstraction that's a legal abstraction when you're coming at this from like a different science. Conversely, a common and in physics, there are hard problems in the few times when this breaks down, and it does break down when it's the black hole paradox is one of them. There's also a traditional one about I'm out of water. But if you swirl water in a cup, like, so you're swirling water, and the water, like, creates a shape, like the swirling shape, and then you stop swirling the cup, how do you can't predict that there was the swirling, you can only see the shape. So how do you actually understand the state of the universe after the swirling has stopped? And so in some sense, there's a problem with looking at this point in the universe. Are we looking at the universe as it is, or are we looking at the universe after some sort of acceleration that was temporal? And then are we looking at the sort of a very weird version of the laws that, because they've been affected over time? And so there are a few questions here about, like, even time can't be assumed to be abstracted in physics. And and there's the black hole paradox too, the information loss paradox. If people want to ask about that, I can say something hopefully not moronic about it, but that's something else. Okay. Conversely, a common rebuttal from researchers: we need to stop coming up with paradoxes. Paradoxes are great. That means there's still more shit to learn in the world. Hey, DeMarshall, hope you're doing well. Especially when we come up with new ones. That means there's something new and interesting to talk about. Conversely, a common rebuttal from researchers whose work has failed to replicate in high-profile and large-scale replications has been to point to possible inattention to crucial contextual factors such as hidden moderators or incomplete procedures that were lacking in the replications. You never found the solution for one? Well, I'm not saying, and I hope you're doing well, I just hope you're having a good day, but the point is not that you found a solution for one. It's that there's something new that's different about the world now, that we had what we thought was something that was not interesting, and now there's something interesting about it. I'm getting by, DeMarshall. This is a long paper, but it was a request, and we're getting to the end of it, about the replication crisis in psychology, which is a very contemporary and interesting topic. That it looks like there's interesting problems in psychology that have all sort of come to a head in the last decade. That a lot of stuff we thought was true in psychology may very well not be, and why? What's the failure of science, and what's was it maybe it's not just failure? Did science fail? Did our concept of science fail? Did these researchers fail? And we've just been discussing it, but we're almost done now. Oh, I'm happy you're enjoying it. Okay. One reason these objections find traction is because from the original context may be that any variation from the original context may be sufficient to explain why replication likewise varies in its findings. In essence, these challenges arise because universalist notions of replication and generalizability prioritize sameness and unchangeability from one context to the next, offering little guidance on how to handle contextual particulars other than to filter them out, that is, holding conditions constant, or to revise universalistic theories to assimilate these particulars. And this is an interesting point. You can always make up a new law in the universe. If you want to make up a law that this cup moves this way, you can make a law that says that. Then my hand is following the cup, not the other way around.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Side Semiotics gifted 19 bits. Side Semiotics says seems with THISBATTRNOTCUTOFFMYINE.
What the heck was that? What the heck was that? I think it spelled it out. Am I going to have to, wow, okay. I'm going to have to put everything into, I have to downcase everything. That's weird. I did not know, all caps. Yeah, I did not know I failed at all caps. Yeah, no one has put in all caps before. I never tested with all caps. Yeah, okay, that's a one-line change, but damn. All right. Oh, hilarious. But on the upside, it didn't cut it off. I'm like sweating. You don't know how hot it is in here at the moment. I feel like going aerosol, just going shirt free off for free.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Side Semiotics gifted 1 bits. Side Semiotics says, she are trying again more softly, and failure is not the same thing as spelling it out.
Thank you for testing that. I appreciate it, because now I have like a confirmation that it may really have been the caps. Thank you for the bits. I appreciate it.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Side Semiotics gifted 1 bits. Side Semiotics says, she for example IPNU.
That's great. Nintendo.
You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much.
Side Semiotics gifted 1 bits. Side Semiotics says, she Chirikup.
Cheer up. Nintendo Pharmacon says, thank you again for the bits, Semiotics. I feel like huge in the rep crisis is the role of career incentives in academia and ideological groupthink. Until it's acceptable to reach politically unpopular conclusions in the social sciences, I don't think see things getting better. Yeah, they were talking about that earlier in the sociology of what gets published and in academia. And this is known, and they were mentioning it a while back. So there's questions, and they were saying certain journals have adopted certain policies that they're going to try to publish different conclusions. But again, talking about like politically unpopular things, extremely hard to get people to change and publish stuff that it's a good point to bring up. It's not like I can't assume everyone's like read this paper or was here the whole time. And so it's like it's a good point that like it needs reiterating sometimes, that these parts of academia that are kind of unsavory, that like, you know, certain things get published because they're hot or they're politically useful right now, you know, that's a problem. But like, is there any corrective thing in the science that's addressing them? And maybe that's what we can talk about here too, that like what exactly is changing over time, and is there like unchangeability that makes a difference, and will filter that out? And I don't know. That's a really good question. Like, what is about science that will correct for that? And I don't actually know if it what exactly will do it. But I mean, they did talk about it earlier. Okay. Similarly, the critique of questionable research practices has highlighted the fact that problems with QRPs arise, in part as researchers provide insufficient detail into the particularities of their studies. Readmap says, to be fair, one of the central principles of sociology research is that it should work to benefit society, and this was harkened strongly by many sociological thinkers and pioneering thinkers. It is a central ethical principle that is core to the discipline. See, that's interesting, but like, is that a bias that is messing people up? I mean, it sounds like a good thing, but how good is it playing out to be? Victor Source, to be clear, do you think the inculcation of formal logic is not a practical solution? No, I don't think it's practical, because I don't think the scientists are going to, they may learn it, I think they're going to forget it immediately. They're not going to use it. Because, you know, you're talking about a scientist and not a logician and not a philosopher. The philosophers like the logic because it will, for what they like it for. And I expect the scientists, some of them will like it, but I think a lot of them will just see it as a waste of their time. You don't pay attention to that when you do sociology research? Well, there we go. But I mean, have you ever learned formal logic, Shane? I mean, I don't know if you have. Maybe you wouldn't. Your point is to understand why people do crap. That if that hurts overall, maybe that's for the best. This is the problem. If you're trying to figure out why people do stuff, is formal logic going to help? And that's the thing. It will help maybe in writing a paper and understanding how to express your ideas clearly and formally, but will it help you when it comes to the work that the sociologists want to do? Probably not, and that's one of the barriers for acceptance of formal logic, is because it's not going to help in doing the work of the sociology. It will help in all the other things, but like the thing the sociologists want to do Yeah, as Shane says, it will help in getting everything set up, but the thing people want to do in sociology is you want to figure out stuff about human, and that's not going to help then. And so you're telling people you should like learn this like paperwork basically, and that's hard. Nintendo Pharmacon says, yeah, that's a problem in your opinion. Having ethical restraint is one thing, activism guiding research is another. Yeah. So Victor says, I see maybe there's an institutional error in that the logic is not deemed a respectable methodology in comparison to obvious empirical implication. Yeah, see, that's part of it. And that's like, how do you get people to learn institutionally about things differently? And like, that's why I'm thinking it's, when you say, is it a good thing? Yes, but is it practical? I think not, because it'd have to change the whole sort of way people go about their work to like do things according to a more formal way. And that's not what they are interested in at the moment. Reading Map says it's biased here. Whether it's good or not is something else, although there are plenty of sociologists that disagree, and sociology involves many other disciplines besides sociology. So even if it's a principle, there's still work to be done for the sake of the work. There are all sorts of paradigms in sociology. Yeah. Victor says, yeah, why was formal logic invented? Just follow the rules and you will find amazing things. Yeah, but you might not find sociological things, Victor. So you'll find amazing things, but if you're interested in sociology, studying formal logic is not going to tell you about people for the most part, or not going to tell you sociological things about people. Yeah. So it's like yes, you're going to find interesting things, but are you going to find things that are interesting sociologically? No. And so, like, to each their own. The issue is that no human is going to act logically all the time. Yeah, no one's going to follow the logic. It's not what happens. Okay. Thus, many reforms have called for much more thorough documentation of the details of study, not only to promote better accountability of research practices, but to also help others to better contextualize findings in terms of what did or did not happen in the study. Yeah, usually just learning about Socrates and then all men are Socrates. There we go, exactly, semiotics. All men are Socrates. Has anyone ever smoked a cigarette or eaten cake? Hopefully lots of cake, not so much on the cigarettes. Of course, these reforms have not arisen out of overt critique of universalism and a pursuit of practices grounded in contextual frameworks. Nintendo says, the logic of science is statistics. You never know some proposition is absolutely true. You just have data. Definitely more for stats. Yeah, social sciences. Yeah, and that was also discussed here earlier. Are people really understanding the statistics they're using? And that's an important question. Excuse me. Yeah, so they want more stuff written down so people can understand what there may have been some underlying other stuff going on. Shane, what have you not taught? This move may signal a greater openness to and appreciation for alternative approaches that reject universalism in favor of contextualism and particularity. For instance, many of the theories and practices surrounding qualitative research could offer not only alternative philosophical conceptions grounded in interpretivist contextualism, but also a rich tradition of practices that could inform and serve the reforms already underway. You haven't taught math, okay. We would argue, for example, that reforms that have led to efforts to more rigorously document the research process through pre-registration, open trials, open data, and registered reports could be fruitfully reframed in terms of case study methodology. And we were talking about this earlier, and is anyone going to put the fucking time in for this? Not unless there's money behind it. If an experiment is framed as a case, a particular event situated in a particular time, place, and culture, researchers would need to provide rigorous documentation of the case, similar to what these reforms already call for. This is why, like, oh my god, are you going to actually be able to do all of this? Probably not. People do not account for missing data, statistically, yeah. And you never taught science either, interesting. Yeah, science and math. So you didn't do the, stuff with math, I guess. However, a case study methodology would also demand that they do so with explicit awareness that a crucial part of understanding the evidentiary value of their study depends on providing a rich contextual account of the particularities of the study. A case is understood first and foremost as an event situated in a particular time and place, and any generalizations Any generalizations beyond the case demand deference to that fact. Such applications of the case to new contexts could consider not only similarities across contexts, but also relationships of contrast and difference, allowing researchers to better account for the various particularities in their studies, such as those differences across replications. This is never going to happen. This is exactly what I've been harping on for the last few pages. People are you're not going to tell scientists that they're not finding the truth. You're not going to do it. That's not how they think about the world. This would take a massive change in the how people understand what we're doing. And so you can't be telling people, oh, you're not actually finding out the truth and the way the world is. You're only finding out one little thing about this particular time and place. No, people are going to ignore you and laugh you out of the room if you try to do this. Now, this might be a good idea, but this is a big ol' not gonna actually happen. Yeah, dude, if I'm God, everyone is fucked because I'm skating by on bullshit and as little work as possible most times. Yeah. You don't have to make it that obvious, Shane. Oh my God. And so this is it. Last page. This is the longest paper I've read in a while. We're getting on the 3-hour mark for stream. Maybe the real issue is that not enough logicians are analyzing the inaccuracies of current theories, and if they are, people are not giving them enough credibility. I can guarantee you people don't fucking listen to me, Victor Sor. I've written stuff before and people are like, yeah, whatever, that's nice, and then they just ignore it. I wrote a paper a while back and I got rejected, and it said, look, you point to interesting things that are, wrong with the that could be that these theories could do otherwise, but you did not provide enough reason why we should believe you over them. And I was like, I said in the paper, this is all the problems I'm solving with all their stuff. I didn't give a reason to believe me, but I showed why mine was better than all of theirs. And they rejected it on the grounds that it was interesting but not informative, in the sense that I didn't give an independent reason to like mine other than I fixed everyone else's problems. And it's I can just say, this is what happens. They want the new. And so the fact that you're coming in and showing them that the logic isn't making sense and that there's better ways to look at it, it's it's just not how things go. Yeah, it's a reviewer too. Yeah, blind review. Philosophy's always blind, or almost always. So it's yeah. And the funny part was the person understood the paper. They were okay. And I was just fine. If you don't want to publish these kinds of papers on these grounds, I understand. And I didn't really send the paper out after that because I was look, I didn't realize that they didn't care for me to correct their sort of reasoning. They wanted something new about it. That's deep. You said philosophy is always blind. It's going on the clipboard. Yeah, well, that's probably the smartest thing I've said all day. Shane says, there's a lot of value in quantitative sociology. I really do think so. And before COVID borked my master's thesis research, I was mostly quantitative analysis. The issue that quantitative sociologists don't want to admit is that you can't do just quantitative analysis of society. You have to have qualitative theory to try to make sense of the math. Yeah, that's a great point. This is the garbage in, garbage out thing. You can do as much quantitative analysis as you want, but as we were talking about early on in this cast, if you have garbage qualitative data to begin with, you don't get anywhere. Yeah, but that's the sociology of this crap, Victor Sor. That's just how it is. You have to play the game in the way they want to play, and it's a problem, and how do you get people to fix it? It's not clear. Do a paper about the interruptive effects of COVID-19 on research that has been in progress and is now reframed. I'm sure that paper exists. Question would be finding it, but yeah. Okay. Last little bit in this paper, though. Overall, we see a number of reasons to be optimistic about the reform that has taken place in response to the replication crisis. Although the reform has tended to emphasize methodological and statistical reforms over the sort of evaluation of psychology's philosophical foundations that some theoretical psychologists might prefer, we would argue that these reforms are nonetheless valuable. I'm a statistic in that paper. There you go. I'm a statistic. That is, inasmuch as researchers are committed to post-positivist revisions of science, aligning practices to more rigorously approach that ideal is probably a good thing. And as we have argued above, many of the practices offered by reformers may signal an openness to values and goals for alternative visions of science, even if such visions are not necessarily what are inspiring the reforms. The reform movement's sensitivity to the role that social, economic, and political systems have played in the replication crisis suggests a potential receptivity to alternative visions of science that more fundamentally define science and is practiced in terms of such systems. Likewise, the revelation from this crisis that methodological safeguards failed to detect and prevent so many problematic practices may challenge reformers to confront the limitations of objectivist epistemologies and universalist ontologies that appear to have shrouded these systemic influences rather than kept them at bay, and to consider non-objectivist alternatives. Furthermore, the growing sensitivity in the reform movement to context and particularity in research may signal an openness to alternative visions of science that reject universalism in favor of the contextualist worldviews. Thus, we see many points of entry for theoretical and philosophical psychology to contribute to the reform movement and spur a more foundational reform. All right, that was it. This is the longest paper I've done in a very long amount of time. Not a bad paper. I mean, it was not it wasn't as much like hard philosophy, or not hard philosophy, not as like abstract philosophy that has been going on for a bit, but this was philosophy of psychology and a little bit of contemporary history of what the field of psychology has been going through, so it's been cool. So what was objectivism? This one was not talked about. No, it was not Ayn Rand. It was that you're talking about objective things in science, that the objects of science are objective, that you're finding objective like objective phenomena in psychology. Like there's going to be objective parts of our psychology that you're going to find, and so it's a scientific objectivism, not the Ayn Rand version.